December 11th, 1978. JFK Airport, 3:17 in the morning. The security lights cast long shadows across the tarmac of the Lufthansa cargo terminal. Inside, employees are going through their routines, processing shipments, filing paperwork, counting the minutes until their shift ends. They have no idea that in the next 64 minutes, their lives will change forever. $6 million is about to vanish. The largest cash robbery in American history is about to unfold, but that's just one night, one heist, one moment in a story that spans decades, the real story, the one that inspired Martin Scorsese's masterpiece Goodfellas. That story is darker, bloodier, and stranger than anything Hollywood could imagine. It's a story of three men from Brooklyn who built an empire on stolen goods, brutal violence, and broken loyalty. It's the story of Henry Hill, Jimmy Burke, and Tommy DeSimone. Real mobsters, real crimes, real consequences tonight. We're going deep into the shadows of Brooklyn's streets, into the back rooms of Robert's Lounge, into the brutal world of the Lucchese crime family in the 1960s and 70s. This is the true story behind Goodfellas. Every fact, every murder, every betrayal. Welcome to the underworld. But before we dive into the blood-soaked streets of 1970s New York, I want to hear from you. Where in the world are you watching from? Drop your city and country in the comments below. What time is it where you are? Are you settling in for the night, or are you grinding through your day? If you're a fan of true crime, Mafia history, or just love a good story that'll keep you company through the night, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Ring that bell so you never miss a story. And if you're enjoying this already, show some love with a like. It helps more people discover these untold stories of America's most notorious gangsters. Now, let's go back to Brooklyn, 1955, where a young boy named Henry Hill first looked across the street and saw his future. Henry Hill was born on June 11th, 1943, in Brownsville, Brooklyn, in the middle of World War II. His father, Henry Hill Sr., was an Irish-American electrician, a hard-working man who believed in honest labor and following the rules. His mother, Carmela Costa, was Sicilian, bringing with her the traditions and culture of southern Italy. From the moment Henry entered the world, he was caught between these two identities, straddling two worlds that didn't always mix well. In the rigid, unforgiving hierarchy of the Italian-American Mafia, La Cosa Nostra, this thing of ours. This mixed heritage would matter more than anyone could have imagined when little Henry was born. The mob was strictly Italian. Not just culturally Italian, but provably Italian. Both sides of your family had to be from Italy for you to become a made man. A full member of the organization, Henry's Irish father meant the door would always be closed to him. No matter how much he accomplished, no matter how much money he made, no matter how many crimes he committed. But in 1943, as an infant in his mother's arms, none of that mattered yet. Henry was just another kid in Brownsville, one of thousands growing up in the crowded streets of Brooklyn in the post-war years. Brownsville in the 1940s and 1950s wasn't the safest neighborhood in New York City. It was rough, working class, crowded with families who'd come from Europe looking for a better life. The streets were narrow. The buildings were old. The apartments were small and cramped. Families struggled to make ends meet. Men worked long hours in factories or on construction sites. Women raised children and managed households. Everyone was trying to survive, trying to climb up from poverty to something better. But for young Henry, growing up in this environment, Brownsville was home. It was all he knew. The sounds of the city, car horns, elevated trains, people shouting in Italian and English and Yiddish, were the soundtrack of his childhood. The smells of Italian cooking pouring from apartment windows, the sight of laundry hanging between buildings, the feeling of hot concrete under his feet in summer. These were the textures of his world. And directly across the street from the Hill family's apartment was something that would change Henry's life forever. Something that would redirect the entire trajectory of his existence, pulling him away from the legitimate life his father wanted for him and into something darker and more dangerous. A cab stand. But this wasn't just any cab stand. This wasn't a simple business where neighborhood residents could call for a taxi. This was a front, a headquarters, a castle, the base of operations for Paul Vario, a corporation, a captain in the Lucchese crime family, one of New York's 5 families that controlled organized crime throughout the city. From his bedroom window, young Henry could watch the wise guys coming and going at all hours of the day and night. He saw the expensive cars pulling up, Cadillacs, Lincolns, vehicles that cost more than his father made in a year. He saw men in perfectly tailored suits, their shoes shined to a mirror finish, their hair slicked back with pomade. He saw beautiful women arriving in expensive dresses. He saw envelopes of cash being passed around. He saw people treating these men with a level of respect and fear that Henry had never seen anyone show his father or any other working man. Most importantly, he saw power, real power, the kind of power that made people step aside on the sidewalk, the kind of power that meant you never waited in line at restaurants, the kind of power that meant you lived by your own rules, not the rules that governed everyone else, Henry would later say, in one of the most famous lines from Goodfellas. As far back as I can remember, I always wanted to be a gangster. He wasn't exaggerating. He wasn't being dramatic. From a very young age, Henry Hill looked at the wise guys across the street and thought, that's what I want to be. Not a doctor, not a lawyer, not a businessman, a gangster. To me, Henry would later explain, being a gangster was better than being president of the United States. Even before I first wandered into the cab stand for an after-school job, I knew I wanted to be a part of them. It was there that I belonged, to me. It meant being somebody in a neighborhood that was full of nobodies. They weren't like anybody else. I mean, they did whatever they wanted. They double-parked in front of a hydrant, and nobody ever gave them a ticket. In the summer, when they played cards all night, nobody ever called the cops. This was intoxicating to a young boy. The wise guys represented everything that Henry's legitimate, working-class world was not. They were exciting. They were wealthy. They were free. They answered to no one except their own. They had respect, fear, admiration. They had power over their own lives and over the lives of others. Henry's father worked 12-hour days as an electrician and came home exhausted, barely making enough to support his family. The wise guys across the street seemed to do nothing but stand around and talk. And yet they drove expensive cars and wore expensive clothes and always had thick wads of cash in their pockets. To an 11-year-old boy, the choice seemed obvious. In 1955, when Henry was 11 or 12 years old, he made his move. He walked across the street, entered the cab stand, and asked if he could help out. Run errands, sweep the floors, deliver packages, whatever they needed. He just wanted to be around them. He wanted to be part of their world. The wise guys looked at this skinny kid with the big eyes and the eager smile, this half-Irish, half-Italian kid from across the street, and they saw potential. They saw a young boy who could be useful, a boy who could run errands without attracting attention, a boy who wanted to learn, a boy who could be molded. They gave him a chance. At first, Henry's jobs were simple and straightforward. He'd run across the street to the deli to get sandwiches for the crew. He'd deliver packages, small envelopes, never asking what was inside, to addresses around the neighborhood. He'd sweep up the cab stand at the end of the day. He'd wash cars. He'd do whatever menial task needed doing. But what Henry was really learning was a way of life. a philosophy, a worldview that was completely different from what his father had tried to teach him. The wise guys treated him with respect, not the patronizing respect you might show a child, but real respect, the kind you show to a colleague or an associate. They talked to him like he was a grown-up. They asked his opinions. They included him in conversations. They taught him the language of the streets, not just the slang and the curse words, but the deeper language of gestures and looks and unspoken understandings. And they gave him money. More money than any kid his age should have. A $20 bill here, a $50 bill there, sometimes more. For a boy whose father struggled to put food on the table, this money was revelatory. Henry started buying things. Clothes, shoes, records. He'd take girls out and pay for everything. He felt rich. He felt powerful. Henry loved every second of it. He loved the respect. He loved the money. He loved the sense of belonging to something important, something powerful, something secret. He loved the feeling that he was on the inside of something that most people would never understand. But there was a problem. Henry was supposed to be in school. His father, an honest working man who believed in education and legitimate work, expected his son to attend school every day, to learn a trade, to prepare for a regular job and a regular life. Henry had other ideas. He started skipping school to work at the cab stand. At first, it was just occasionally, playing hooky once a week, maybe twice. But soon, he was missing school 3 or 4 days a week, then every day. He'd leave his apartment in the morning with his books like he was going to school, but instead, he'd cross the street to the cab stand and spend the entire day with the wise guys. The truancy officers started noticing. They started sending letters home, official letters on official paper, informing Mr. and Mrs. Hill that their son was not attending school as required by law, that there would be consequences if this behavior continued, that the family could face legal action. This is where Henry learned his first real lesson about mob power. This is where he learned that the wise guys across the street didn't just have money and respect. They had reach. They had influence. They could solve problems in ways that regular people couldn't imagine. The wise guys at the cab stand didn't like that Henry was getting in trouble. They didn't like that his father was angry with him. They liked Henry. He was useful. He was eager. And he was learning fast. They wanted to keep him around. So they took care of the problem. They kidnapped the mailman, not violently, not with guns or threats of death, but they had a conversation with him. A serious conversation. They explained the situation. They explained that young Henry Hill was a good kid who was helping them out, and that these truancy letters were causing problems. They explained, in terms that left no room for misunderstanding, that any future letters about Henry Hill's school attendance should not make it to the Hill household. The mailman understood. He was probably terrified. He probably couldn't sleep that night. But he understood. The letters stopped coming. Henry's father never knew his son was skipping school almost every day. Mr. Hill thought Henry was getting an education, preparing for a legitimate career, staying out of trouble. In reality, Henry was getting a very different kind of education. The kind you can't get in any school. The kind that teaches you how to steal, how to intimidate, how to operate outside the law. By his mid-teens, Henry was fully embedded in the life. He wasn't just running errands anymore. He was participating in crimes, small stuff at first, helping to fence stolen goods, acting as a lookout during robberies, collecting debts from loan shark customers. But gradually, as he proved himself reliable and trustworthy, the crimes got bigger. Henry learned how to hijack trucks, how to spot valuable cargo, how to fence stolen goods through legitimate-seeming businesses. He learned about loan sharking, how to calculate the interest, usually 5 points a week, meaning if you borrowed $1,000, you owed $50 in interest every single week. how to collect from reluctant borrowers, how to know when violence was necessary, and when a simple threat would suffice. He learned about the numbers racket, an illegal lottery that operated throughout the Italian neighborhoods of New York. He learned about bookmaking, taking illegal bets on horse races and sporting events. He learned about extortion, about how legitimate businesses could be forced to pay protection money to avoid having their windows broken or their inventory destroyed. He learned about arson, about how insurance fraud worked, about how you could burn down a failing business and collect more money from the insurance company than the business was worth. He learned which fire marshals could be bribed, which insurance adjusters looked the other way, which lawyers knew how to handle these situations. Most importantly, Henry learned about violence. He learned that in this world, violence wasn't something extraordinary or unusual. It was a tool, like a hammer or a screwdriver. You used it when necessary. You used it to enforce debts, to maintain respect, to send messages, to solve problems. Henry watched men get beaten with baseball bats over unpaid debts of a few $100s. He watched people disappear, never to be seen again. He helped clean up blood. He helped dispose of evidence, and he learned to accept it. This was just how the world worked. This was the price of the life he'd chosen. Henry met the key players in Paul Vario's crew during these formative years. He met Jimmy Burke, the Irish-American criminal mastermind who was always planning the next big score. He met Tommy DeSimone, the violent psychopath who killed people the way other people swatted flies. He met dozens of other criminals, each with their own specialties, their own reputations, their own stories. He learned who to respect and who to fear. He learned when to speak and when to keep his mouth shut. He learned that in this world, loyalty was everything. And he learned, though it would take him years to fully understand this lesson, that the consequences of disloyalty were swift, brutal, and permanent by the time he was 16 or 17. Henry Hill was no longer just a kid from Brownsville who ran errands for mobsters. He was connected. He was part of something bigger than himself. He was becoming a wise guy, even if he could never become a made man. And Henry had learned to live with that limitation. Yes, his Irish blood meant he could never be formally inducted into La Cosa Nostra. He could never take the oath, never become a full member, never have the full protection that came with being made. But so what? He was young. He was making money, good money. More than he'd ever imagined. He had respect on the streets. He was living the life he'd always dreamed of. The formal ceremony, the button, the full membership. All of that seemed distant and unimportant when you were a teenager with pockets full of cash and the respect of the most feared men in Brooklyn. Henry was hooked, completely, utterly, irrevocably hooked on the life and the man who had hooked him. The man who had given him his start, the man who would be his boss and his mentor for the next 15 years, was Paul Vario. Paul Vario was born on July 10, 1914, in Brooklyn, New York, in a neighborhood that was predominantly Italian. His parents were immigrants from Italy, part of the massive wave of Southern Italian immigration that transformed New York City in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. They came to America looking for opportunity, for a better life than the poverty and limited prospects they'd known in the old country. What they found in Brooklyn was hard work, crowded tenements, and a community of fellow Italian immigrants who were trying to navigate this strange new world. And in that community, alongside the legitimate businesses and hard-working families, was another world, the world of organized crime. Paul Vario grew up in this environment. He saw the power that criminals wielded in the neighborhood. He saw how the gangsters were respected, feared, and wealthy. He saw that crime offered a faster path to success than legitimate work ever could. From a very young age, Vario showed a propensity for violence and criminal behavior. At age 11, just 11 years old, he was sent to juvenile detention for 7 months. The exact charges from this early brush with the law are lost to history, buried in records that were either destroyed or sealed. But it was serious enough to warrant removing a child from his home and placing him in juvenile custody. That early stint in detention didn't reform young Paul Vario. If anything, it probably hardened him. Juvenile detention in 1920s New York was brutal, overcrowded, violent, and more likely to create hardened criminals than rehabilitate troubled youth. As Vario grew older, his criminal activities escalated. And then, in 1937, when Paul Vario was 23 years old, he was convicted of a crime that stands out in his record like a bloodstain. A crime that reveals something dark about his character. Even as a young man raped, the victim was 16 years old. Paul Vario was convicted and sent to prison. The details of the case are sparse. Newspapers of the era didn't cover every criminal trial, especially not those involving working-class Italian Americans in Brooklyn. But the conviction is a matter of record. Paul Vario raped a teenage girl, and he went to prison for it. He served his time, and when he got out, he went right back to crime. Throughout the 1940s and 1950s, Vario worked his way up through the ranks of the Lucchese crime family. The Lucchese family was one of New York's 5 families. The 5 major Italian-American organized crime groups that controlled illegal activities throughout the city. The other families were the Gambino, Genovese, Colombo, and Bonanno families together. These 5 families formed a kind of organized crime consortium, dividing up territories and rackets, sometimes cooperating and sometimes fighting each other for control. The Lucchese family, under boss Tommy Lucchese, controlled various rackets in Brooklyn, Manhattan, and the Bronx. They were involved in gambling, loan sharking, labor racketeering, drug trafficking, though this was officially discouraged, extortion, and dozens of other criminal enterprises. Paul Vario proved himself to the Lucchese leadership slowly and methodically. He showed he was capable, able to organize crimes, manage subordinates, and handle the violence that came with the territory. He showed he was ruthless, willing to hurt or kill anyone who posed a threat or stood in the way. And most importantly, he showed he was loyal. He followed orders, respected the hierarchy, and never talked to law enforcement. In the world of the Mafia, those 3 qualities, capability, ruthlessness, and loyalty, could take you very far. Eventually, Paul Vario became a made man. This was a major milestone. Being made meant taking an oath, becoming a full member of La Cosa Nostra, being straightened out, as they called it. The induction ceremony was secret and ritualistic. According to mob informants, who later described the ceremony, inductees would prick their finger and let blood drip onto a card with the image of a saint. The card would be burned while the inductee took an oath of loyalty and omerta. The code of silence: once you were made, you were protected. Other criminals couldn't kill you without permission from your boss. You had status, respect, and the backing of an entire crime family. But you also had obligations. You owed a percentage of your earnings to your superiors. You had to follow orders, and you had to maintain omerta. You could never cooperate with law enforcement. No matter what, Paul Vario thrived as a made man. He continued proving his worth, and eventually he was promoted to caporeggion, captain. This was a major position in the family hierarchy. A captain had his own crew of soldiers and associates working under him. He controlled certain territories and rackets. He reported directly to the underboss, or the boss himself, as a captain in the Lucchese family. Paul Vario built an empire in Brooklyn. His operations were vast and varied. He ran a bar called Gefkin's on Fulton Street in Brooklyn, which served as a meeting place and headquarters for the crew. He owned a junkyard on Avenue D, which was useful for disposing of stolen vehicles and other evidence. He had interests in construction companies, trucking companies, and various other legitimate businesses that could be used to launder money and provide no-show jobs for associates. But Vario's most valuable asset was his connection to John F. Kennedy International Airport, JFK. JFK Airport in the 1960s and 1970s was a gold mine for organized crime. Every single day, cargo planes from around the world landed at JFK carrying valuable goods. Electronics from Japan, designer clothes from Italy, cigarettes from North Carolina, jewelry from Europe, cash, lots and lots of cash, being transported for various reasons. All of this passed through JFK's cargo terminals, and much of it was vulnerable to theft. Paul Vario's crew had connections throughout the airport. They had corrupt union officials who provided information about valuable shipments. They had workers inside cargo terminals who could disable alarms or leave doors unlocked. They had forklift operators who could move stolen goods to prearranged locations. They had truck drivers who would cooperate with hijackings in exchange for a cut of the proceeds. Vario himself once described the airport as being like Citibank. You needed money? Go to the airport. There was always a score waiting. Hijack a truck, rob a cargo terminal, steal luggage from high-value passengers. The opportunities were endless, and the profits were enormous. Paul Vario's crew at JFK, which included Henry Hill, Jimmy Burke, Tommy DeSimone, and dozens of others, probably stole millions of dollars worth of goods from the airport over the years. Most of these thefts were never solved. Many were never even reported, as the victims didn't want to admit their own security failures. But Paul Vario wasn't just a businessman and an organizer. He was also violent, extremely violent, and he had a temper that could explode without warning, turning a casual evening into a bloodbath in seconds. There's a famous story about Paul Vario that illustrates his violent nature. One evening, Vario and some of his crew went to a restaurant. Vario ordered a drink. The waiter, who was probably busy or distracted or just having a bad day, was slow to bring the drink. Maybe he forgot. Maybe there was a problem in the kitchen. Maybe the bartender was backed up with orders. It didn't matter. When Paul Vario didn't get his drink fast enough, when this waiter showed what Vario perceived as disrespect by not immediately attending to his needs, Vario and his crew took the waiter outside, and they beat him, not just a punch or two. They beat him with baseball bats and pipes. They beat him until he was a bloody mess on the sidewalk, until he probably wished he was dead. The waiter survived. But he learned a lesson. You don't disrespect Paul Vario. You don't make Paul Vario wait. You don't treat Paul Vario like he's just another customer. This wasn't an isolated incident. Paul Vario routinely used violence to enforce his will, to maintain his reputation, to remind people that he was not someone to be trifled with. He broke bones. He put people in the hospital, and sometimes, when the situation called for it, he ordered people killed. Vario had a famous rule that he drilled into everyone who worked for him. A rule that he repeated constantly. Never put your name on anything. No bank accounts in your name. No deeds to property in your name. No car registrations in your name. No paper trail whatsoever that could connect you to your assets. Because if the government can't prove you own something, they can't take it away. If the IRS can't show where your money came from, they can't tax it. If law enforcement can't document your assets, they can't seize them. This philosophy served Paul Vario extremely well over the decades. He accumulated enormous wealth while maintaining the appearance of being a simple working-class guy. On paper, he had almost nothing. In reality, he was making a fortune. At his peak in the 1970s, Paul Vario was earning an estimated $25,000 per day. Not per week, not per month, per day. That's over $9 million per year. Approximately $33 million in today's money. probably more when you account for actual purchasing power. And that's just Vario's personal income, not counting what his crew was earning or what he was kicking up to the Lucchese family leadership. But Vario was smart enough to know that being a mob captain wasn't just about making money. It was about controlling your territory, managing your crew, maintaining relationships with other families, and knowing when to use violence and when to show restraint. It was about respect and fear in equal measure. It was about being smart enough to avoid law enforcement while being ruthless enough that nobody dared cross you. Paul Vario was a master at this balancing act. He managed to avoid serious prison time for most of his career. Despite being involved in countless crimes, he maintained good relationships with the other families while protecting his own crew's interests. He earned enormous amounts of money while keeping a relatively low profile. He was, by all accounts, an extremely successful mob captain. When young Henry Hill showed up at the cab stand in 1955, Paul Vario saw potential. He saw a kid who was eager, who was smart, who was hungry for the life, and Vario knew that these kids, the young associates who started in their early teens, were the future of the organization. Cultivate them young, teach them right, and they'd be loyal soldiers for decades. So Paul Vario took Henry Hill under his wing. He gave him work, he gave him money, he gave him access to the life. He taught him the rules, the philosophy, the way of thinking that separated wise guys from civilians. And in return, Henry gave Vario his loyalty. For years, for 15 years. That loyalty was absolute. Henry idolized Paul Vario. He saw Vario as a father figure, someone who'd given him opportunities that his real father never could. Someone who'd shown him a way out of poverty and powerlessness. Someone who'd made him somebody in a neighborhood full of nobodies. But working for Paul Vario meant working alongside some very dangerous men. And the most dangerous, the most unpredictable, the one who would eventually help bring down the entire crew, was a man named Jimmy Burke, James Burke, known as Jimmy Burke. Or sometimes Jimmy the Gent, was born on July 5, 1931. To an Irish immigrant mother named Jane Burke. His father was unknown, either absent or unacknowledged. From the very first moment of his life, Jimmy Burke's existence was marked by hardship and abandonment. His mother was unmarried, which in the 1930s carried enormous social stigma. She was poor, struggling to survive in Depression-era New York. She was probably overwhelmed by the responsibility of raising a child alone. Whether she was unable or unwilling to care for young Jimmy, the result was the same. He was sent into the foster care system, and Jimmy Burke's childhood in the foster care system was a nightmare. He was passed from home to home, never staying anywhere long enough to form real attachments or feel secure. In 1930s and 1940s America, the foster care system was largely unregulated and often brutal. Foster parents received small stipends from the state for each child they took in, which created an incentive to take as many children as possible while spending as little as possible on their care. In many of these homes, Jimmy was beaten. Physical punishment was considered normal and necessary. Spare the rod, spoil the child. But what Jimmy experienced went beyond normal discipline. He was beaten regularly, severely, for minor infractions or for no reason at all. He was made to feel worthless, unwanted, less than human. And in at least one home, possibly more, Jimmy Burke was sexually abused. He never spoke about this publicly in detail. The shame and trauma of childhood sexual abuse kept many victims silent in that era, but it was alluded to by people who knew him, and it helps explain the rage that would define his adult life. There's a story about one of Jimmy's foster fathers that became almost legendary among people who knew Burke. This foster father was abusive, violent, unpredictable. He would fly into rages and beat young Jimmy for the smallest reasons. One day, This man was driving with Jimmy in the car. They were on a road somewhere in Queens or Brooklyn. The man was angry about something. Maybe Jimmy had talked back. Maybe he'd made a mistake. Maybe the man was just in a bad mood. The foster father reached back to hit Jimmy while he was driving. He was turned around in his seat, his hand raised to strike the boy. But in doing so, he lost control of the vehicle. The car swerved, went off the road, and crashed. The impact was severe. The foster father died in that accident. Young Jimmy Burke was relatively unharmed. This incident, this moment where his abuser's violence led directly to his own death, must have been formative for Jimmy. It taught him a lesson. Sometimes, violence has consequences for the person using it. Sometimes, if you're patient, if you're smart, your enemies destroy themselves. And sometimes, the universe provides a kind of justice, even if it's accidental. But more than that, it probably reinforced something dark in Jimmy's psychology. It showed him that death could be a solution to problems, that the people who hurt you could be removed from your life permanently. As Jimmy grew older and eventually aged out of the foster care system, he was angry, damaged, and without any real family or support system. He turned to crime almost inevitably. What else was there for him? He had no education to speak of. He had no legitimate job prospects. He had no money and no connections to the legitimate world. But he had intelligence. He had a calculating mind that could plan complex operations. And he had absolutely no moral restraints. No empathy. No hesitation about hurting people. The abuse he'd suffered hadn't made him compassionate or understanding. It had made him into something cold and ruthless. Jimmy Burke started working as a criminal in his late teens and early 20s. He did truck hijackings, burglaries, armed robberies. He was good at it, meticulous in his planning, bold in execution, and smart about covering his tracks. By his mid-20s, Burke was working with organized crime figures. Though his Irish heritage meant he could never be a made man in the Italian Mafia. This actually gave him a kind of freedom. He wasn't bound by all the rules that governed made men. He could work with anyone, do business with anyone, kill anyone, as long as he didn't step on the wrong toes or violate the few rules that applied to everyone. Burke developed a relationship with the Lucchese family. Specifically with Paul Vario's crew, he became a trusted associate, someone who could be relied on to execute complex crimes and keep his mouth shut if arrested. Jimmy Burke earned the nickname Jimmy the Gent because of his habit of being generous in certain contexts. He would tip waiters and bartenders extravagantly. He would buy drinks for everyone in a bar. He would help out people in the neighborhood who were struggling financially. He cultivated an image as a stand-up guy, a generous criminal, someone who took care of his people. But that nickname was darkly, horrifically ironic, because Jimmy Burke was also one of the most prolific murderers in American organized crime history. Law enforcement would eventually attribute 60 to 70 murders to Jimmy Burke, though the real number is almost certainly higher. Many of his victims were never found. Their bodies were buried in remote locations, crushed in car compactors, dissolved in acid, or disposed of in ways that made identification impossible. Burke was a careful killer. He didn't kill in passion or anger, at least not usually. His murders were calculated, planned, and executed with precision. He killed to eliminate witnesses, to tie up loose ends, to send messages, or simply because killing someone was more convenient than letting them live. There's a story about Jimmy Burke's wedding day that reveals the depth of his brutality. Burke was getting married, presumably a happy occasion, a celebration of love and new beginnings. But Burke's fiancée had an ex-boyfriend who was causing problems. Maybe he was threatening her. Maybe he was making demands. Maybe he just wouldn't accept that the relationship was over. Jimmy Burke's solution was characteristically direct. He had the man murdered, but not just murdered, cut into pieces, dismembered, turned from a human being into unrecognizable chunks of meat. And this happened on Burke's wedding day. On the day he was supposed to be celebrating love and commitment. He had someone butchered. Then Burke got married, smiled for photos, danced with his bride, and presumably enjoyed his reception. That was Jimmy Burke, capable of organizing and executing extreme violence at any moment, for any reason, and then going about his day as if nothing had happened. Burke operated out of a bar in Queens called Robert's Lounge, located at 114 to 45 Lefferts Boulevard in South Ozone Park. The bar became his headquarters, his office, his planning room. It was where the crew would meet to discuss jobs. It was where they'd celebrate successful scores. It was where they'd divide up stolen goods and count money. But Robert's Lounge was also something else, a killing ground. Bodies were buried in the basement of Robert's Lounge. Multiple bodies, over multiple years. When someone needed to be killed and disposed of quickly, Burke would have them brought to the bar. They'd be shot or strangled, and their body would be buried in the dirt floor of the basement. Later, when the basement became too crowded, or when the risk of discovery became too high, Burke changed his disposal method. He had connections with salvage yards and junkyards. The bodies of his victims would be placed in cars, and then the entire car, with the body inside, would be crushed in a car compactor. The resulting cube of metal and organic matter was impossible to sort through, impossible to identify. The bodies became part of the scrap metal that would eventually be melted down and recycled. It was efficient, it was thorough, and it was horrifying. Despite his Irish heritage preventing him from becoming a made man, Jimmy Burke was deeply connected to organized crime and worked closely with the Italian Mafia. His inability to be formally inducted actually gave him certain advantages. Made men had to follow strict rules about who they could work with and what crimes they could commit. They had to share their earnings with their superiors. They had to get permission for major moves. Burke had more freedom. He could work with different families. He could keep more of his earnings. He could be more entrepreneurial in his criminal activities, as long as he didn't disrespect made men or interfere with their operations. He could do pretty much whatever he wanted, and what Jimmy Burke wanted, more than anything, was to pull off big scores. He was always planning the next heist, the next robbery, the next way to steal a large amount of money quickly. He was brilliant at it, understanding security systems, identifying vulnerabilities, recruiting the right people for each job, planning escape routes and backup plans throughout the 1960s and 1970s. Jimmy Burke orchestrated dozens of successful crimes, truck hijackings at JFK Airport, burglaries of jewelry stores and warehouses, armed robberies of businesses. Each score made him richer and enhanced his reputation as a master criminal. But Burke had a fatal flaw: paranoia, deep, consuming paranoia that got worse as he got older. Burke trusted almost no one. He was always worried about people talking to the police, about witnesses identifying him, about loose ends that could bring him down. And Jimmy Burke's solution to paranoia was always the same: murder. If he thought someone might talk, he killed them. If someone knew too much about a crime, he killed them. If someone owed him money and couldn't pay, he killed them. If someone simply made him nervous or uncomfortable, he killed them. This paranoia, combined with his complete lack of empathy and his skill at murder, made Jimmy Burke one of the most dangerous criminals in New York. Even other mobsters were afraid of him. Even made men who technically outranked him were careful about how they interacted with him, because everyone knew that Burke had killed made men before and had gotten away with it because he was too useful and too dangerous to punish. By the mid-1970s, Jimmy Burke was in his mid-40s and at the peak of his criminal career. He had money. He had respect. He had a crew of capable criminals working with him. He was planning bigger and bigger scores, always looking for that one perfect heist that would set him up for life. And then he started hearing rumors, whispers, information being passed through criminal networks. Information about a target so lucrative that it seemed almost impossible. $6 million, one location, one night. The Lufthansa cargo terminal at JFK Airport. But before we get to December 11th, 1978, before we get to the heist that would make history and trigger a bloodbath, we need to talk about the third key figure in this story, the most violent, most unpredictable, most terrifying member of the crew, Thomas DeSimone, Tommy. Thomas Anthony DeSimone was born on May 24, 1950, though some sources say 1946 or 1947. Records from that era are inconsistent. In the Cambridge neighborhood of Boston, Massachusetts, he was the youngest child in a large family, and unlike Henry Hill or Jimmy Burke, Tommy came from Mafia royalty. Crime was literally in his blood, passed down through generations. Tommy's grandfather, Rosario DeSimone, was a mob boss in Los Angeles. Not just a soldier or an associate, but an actual boss, running operations throughout Southern California. Tommy's uncle, Frank DeSimone, eventually took over the Los Angeles crime family, becoming one of the most powerful mob figures on the West Coast. Tommy's older brothers were connected to the Gambino family in New York, one of the most powerful of the 5 families. His sister, Phyllis, was beautiful and caught the attention of Jimmy Burke when she was just 16 years old. She became Burke's mistress, which created the connection that would eventually bring Tommy into Paul Vario's crew and into Burke's orbit. When Tommy's family moved from Boston to New York, while he was still young, they settled in Queens. Tommy grew up in the middle of one of the most active organized crime environments in America. While other kids were playing Little League and going to school, Tommy was being groomed for a life in the mob. It was expected. It was the family business. From a very early age, Tommy DeSimone showed signs of violence, not the calculated, professional violence of an organized criminal, but something more chaotic and disturbing, something that suggested genuine psychopathy, a complete lack of empathy, an inability to feel guilt or remorse, and a tendency toward impulsive, brutal violence. Tommy's connection to Jimmy Burke, through his sister Phyllis, brought him into Burke's crew when he was still a teenager. And in 1965, when Tommy was somewhere between 15 and 19 years old, depending on which birth year is accurate, he was introduced to Paul Vario. Vario saw potential in the kid. Tommy was big for his age. He would eventually reach 6'2" and about 200 pounds of solid muscle. He was also willing to do anything. Absolutely anything. No hesitation, no conscience, no boundaries. In the mob, that kind of willingness was valuable. Frightening, but valuable. Tommy earned several nicknames over the years. One was Spitching Tommy, because of his obsessive habit of polishing his shoes until they gleamed like mirrors. He hated that nickname. It reminded him of being young, of shining shoes for adults, of being treated as less than. When people called him Spitching Tommy, he would fly into rages. Another nickname was Two-Gun Tommy, because he often carried 2 pistols, one in his waistband and another in an ankle holster. This nickname he seemed to embrace. It made him sound dangerous. Like a gunslinger from the Old West, Tommy committed his first murder when he was approximately 17 years old. The victim was a man named Howard Goldstein, a complete stranger who had done absolutely nothing to Tommy. Tommy didn't kill him over a dispute. He didn't kill him for money. He didn't kill him on orders from anyone higher up. Tommy killed Howard Goldstein for practice, to see what it felt like, to find out if he could do it. He walked up to Goldstein on a street in Queens, pulled out a gun, and shot him dead. Then he walked away, just like that. A human life ended because a teenager with a gun wanted to know what murder felt like. This should have been a warning to everyone. This should have marked Tommy as too dangerous, too unstable to have around, but instead it marked him as useful. Because the mob needs people who can kill without hesitation. And Tommy DeSimone was the embodiment of that quality. Throughout his 20s, Tommy's reputation for violence grew. Stories about him spread through the criminal underworld, each one more disturbing than the last. He would throw darts at people during pinochle games if they made him angry, or if he thought they were cheating. Not throw them at the dartboard while they were nearby. Throw them directly at people, aiming for their faces or necks. He would shoot people in the feet to make them dance, laughing as they hopped around screaming in pain. This wasn't about sending a message or collecting a debt. This was entertainment for Tommy. He killed people for target practice. If he got a new gun, he'd test it out on some random person just to see how it performed. He was fueled by cocaine. Constantly, his drug use made him even more paranoid and violent than his baseline personality, which was already deeply disturbed. When Goodfellas came out in 1990, Joe Pesci's portrayal of Tommy DeVito was absolutely terrifying. Pesci brought a chaotic energy to the role, a sense that Tommy could explode into violence at any second over the smallest perceived disrespect. The funny how scene, where Tommy intimidates Henry by pretending to be offended, became one of the most famous scenes in cinema history. Pesci won an Academy Award for the performance. But by all accounts from people who knew the real Tommy DeSimone, Joe Pesci's portrayal, as terrifying as it was, actually toned down Tommy's psychopathy. The real Tommy was even worse. Pesci's Tommy has moments of charm, moments where you can see why people would want to be around him. The real Tommy was just dangerous all the time. The real Tommy didn't have an off switch. He didn't have a sense of proportion. He didn't understand that some things weren't worth killing over. Everything was worth killing over to Tommy. A wrong look, a perceived insult. Forgetting his drink, anything could trigger him. One of Tommy's habits was drinking a gallon of milk every single day. He was obsessed with his physical condition, with being strong and muscular. In his mind, his body was a temple that needed to be maintained and perfected. But his mind was a nightmare factory, constantly generating new reasons to hurt people, new ways to inflict pain, new targets for his rage. Tommy raped women. Multiple women, probably. The exact number is unknown, because most of his victims never reported it. Who would they report it to? The police? Tommy had connections. Pressing charges against a mob-connected criminal in 1960s and 70s New York was a good way to end up dead. Henry Hill worked alongside Tommy DeSimone for years, and Henry was terrified of him. Everyone was terrified of Tommy. Other criminals would try to avoid being around him because his presence meant that any moment, for any reason, extreme violence might erupt. But in the mob, you don't get to choose your coworkers. You work with who you're assigned to work with, and you hope, you pray, that you don't end up on the wrong side of their temper. Jimmy Burke could use Tommy's violence when it was needed for a job. If someone needed to be intimidated or beaten or killed, Tommy was the perfect tool for that job. But even Burke knew that Tommy was barely controllable, that he was a loaded gun that could go off at any moment. Paul Vario tolerated Tommy for several reasons. First, Tommy's family connections to other crime families made him valuable. Having good relationships with the Los Angeles family and the Gambino family was useful for Vario's operations. Second, Tommy was a capable earner when he wasn't flying off the handle. He participated in successful hijackings and robberies. Third, cutting Tommy loose might mean becoming Tommy's next target. And even a made man like Vario understood that. Tommy was dangerous enough that the consequences of rejecting him might outweigh the benefits. So Tommy remained part of the crew, Throughout the 1960s and into the 1970s, he participated in countless crimes. He committed numerous murders. The exact number is unknown, but it was probably dozens. He terrorized people throughout Queens and Brooklyn, and he accumulated enemies, lots and lots of enemies. People who wanted him dead, but were too afraid to make a move. People who were waiting for the right opportunity, for the moment when Tommy would finally go too far and create an opportunity for payback. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, these three men, Henry Hill, Jimmy Burke, and Tommy DeSimone, formed the core of Paul Vario's most active crew. They worked together on countless crimes. They knew each other's strengths and weaknesses. They developed a kind of rhythm, a working relationship that made them highly effective criminals. Henry was the organizer, the guy who knew people and could make connections and facilitate crimes. Jimmy was the mastermind, the planner, the one who could see the big picture and coordinate complex operations. Tommy was the muscle, the enforcer, the one who could be counted on to use violence without hesitation. Together, they were hustling constantly, running scores at JFK Airport, hijacking trucks, loan sharking, bookmaking, extorting businesses, fencing stolen goods every day. There was money to be made and crimes to commit. They were building reputations. They were building wealth. They were building the life they'd always wanted. But they were also building towards something darker. Because in the mob, violence is always just below the surface. The friendships, the loyalty, the sense of family, all of that can evaporate in an instant when money is involved. When someone feels disrespected, when paranoia takes hold, and sometimes that violence erupts in ways that change everything. Sometimes a single act of violence sets off a chain reaction that destroys entire criminal enterprises. For Paul Vario's crew, that moment came in June of 1970, when a made man named Billy Batts came home from prison and made the mistake of insulting Tommy DeSimone. The 1960s were good years for Henry Hill. Relatively speaking, he was young, in his late teens and early 20s. He was making more money than he'd ever imagined. He was living the life he'd dreamed about since childhood. The violence was always there, lurking in the background, but it hadn't touched Henry personally yet. He was still in love with the life. But the path through the 1960s wasn't entirely smooth. In the early part of the decade, Henry briefly joined the United States Army. This wasn't a patriotic decision or a desire to serve his country. It was probably an attempt to avoid prosecution for some crime. Or maybe it was pressure from his father, who still held out hope that Henry might straighten out his life. Whatever the reason, Henry Hill and military discipline did not mix well. The Army expected him to follow orders, to wake up early, to maintain his equipment, to respect authority. Henry had been living outside those rules for years. He'd become accustomed to the freedom of mob life, where you made your own schedule and answered only to your immediate superiors. Henry went AWOL, absent without leave. He simply stopped showing up. He went back to Brooklyn, back to Paul Vario's crew, back to the life he knew. The Army caught him eventually. He was arrested, court-martialed, and served a short sentence in military prison. Then he was dishonorably discharged and sent back to civilian life. Henry returned to Brooklyn and went back to work for Paul Vario full-time. If there had been any doubt about Henry's commitment to the mob life, his Army experience erased it. He wasn't cut out for legitimate life. He wasn't interested in following society's rules. He was a criminal, and that was all he would ever be. The crimes came fast and constant throughout the 1960s. Truck hijackings were a specialty of Vario's crew. They had extensive connections at JFK Airport, which meant they always knew when valuable shipments were coming through. They'd get tips from corrupt union officials, from workers inside cargo terminals, from truck drivers who were willing to cooperate in exchange for a cut of the proceeds. A typical hijacking would work like this. The crew would get word that a truck carrying valuable cargo, electronics, clothing, cigarettes, whatever, was making a delivery. They'd follow the truck or intercept it at a predetermined location. Sometimes the driver was in on it, in which case he'd simply hand over the truck. Other times, they'd force the driver out at gunpoint, take the truck, and leave him unharmed. The stolen goods would be quickly moved to a warehouse or garage, where they'd be unloaded and distributed to fences. People who specialized in selling stolen goods through seemingly legitimate businesses. Within hours, the merchandise would be spread throughout the city. Sold at a discount, impossible to trace. The truck would be abandoned or destroyed. The driver would report the hijacking to police and to his employer. An insurance claim would be filed, and the crew would move on to the next score. These hijackings were incredibly lucrative. A single truck could contain merchandise worth tens of thousands of dollars, sometimes hundreds of thousands. The crew would fence it for maybe 30 or 40 cents on the dollar, a fraction of its retail value, but that still meant enormous profits for relatively low-risk work. One of the crew's biggest scores in the 1960s was the Air France robbery in 1967. A shipment of cash that had been exchanged at banks overseas was being transported through JFK. The crew got word about it, planned the robbery meticulously, and executed it perfectly. They walked away with hundreds of thousands of dollars in untraceable currency. It was a clean job, well planned, well executed. It reinforced Vario's crew's reputation as serious. Professional criminals who could pull off complex operations without getting caught. But the crew wasn't just doing robberies. They had multiple criminal enterprises running simultaneously. Credit card fraud was a major operation. In the 1960s, credit card security was minimal. Numbers weren't encrypted. Verification systems were primitive. The crew had connections who could steal credit card numbers or create fake cards. They'd use these cards to make purchases, to get cash advances, to buy goods that could be resold. By the time the fraud was discovered, the crew would have moved on to new card numbers. Arson for insurance fraud was another lucrative operation. A business owner who was struggling financially would approach the crew. They'd arrange to have the business burned down. The owner would file an insurance claim. Once the insurance money came through, the owner would pay the crew their percentage, usually 50% or more of the total payout. The crew had connections with fire marshals, who could be bribed to rule fires as accidental. They had connections with insurance adjusters who would expedite claims without asking too many questions. They had connections with lawyers who knew how to handle these situations if complications arose. Loan sharking was a constant source of income. The crew would lend money to people who couldn't get loans through legitimate sources, gamblers who needed to pay debts, business owners who needed quick cash, people with poor credit. The interest rates were astronomical, usually 5 points per week. That means if you borrowed $1,000, you owed $50 in interest every single week, indefinitely, until you paid back the principal. Many borrowers could never pay back the principal. They could only afford to pay the weekly interest, which meant they were trapped in perpetual debt. Miss a payment, and the consequences were severe. Beatings, destroyed property, threats against family members. The crew was ruthless about collecting debts. Bookmaking, illegal gambling was another major operation. The crew took bets on horse races, sporting events, boxing matches, anything people would gamble on. Most gamblers lost money over time, and the house, meaning the crew, always took a percentage. They ran numbers rackets. Illegal lotteries that were popular in Italian and black neighborhoods throughout New York. People would place small bets on number combinations, hoping to hit the winning number and receive a large payout. The odds were heavily stacked against the bettors, and the crew made steady profits, Extortion was common. Legitimate businesses in the crew's territory would be forced to pay protection money, a weekly or monthly fee to ensure that nothing bad happened to their business. The implication was clear. Pay up, or your windows get broken, your inventory gets destroyed, your employees get hurt, your business burns down. Some business owners resisted. Most paid. It was cheaper to pay the extortion money than to deal with the consequences of refusing. Henry participated in all of this. He was learning the business from the ground up, learning every aspect of organized crime. He was making good money, thousands of dollars a week, which in 1960s dollars was a substantial income. He was driving a nice car, wearing expensive clothes, eating at the best restaurants. In 1965, when Henry was 22 years old, he met a young woman named Karen Friedman at a party. She was Jewish, which meant this was an intercultural relationship that might have caused problems in some contexts. But in the mob world, as long as you kept making money, nobody cared too much about who you dated. Karen was beautiful, she was smart, and she was fascinated by Henry's lifestyle. He had money. He had connections. He took her to the Copacabana nightclub, one of the most famous venues in New York City. They'd enter through the back, through the kitchen, bypassing the long lines of regular people waiting to get in. The mater d' would greet Henry warmly, shake his hand, escort them to a prime table near the stage. Other wise guys would stop by to say hello. Bottles of champagne would arrive at the table, compliments of various people who wanted to show respect. Karen had never experienced anything like this. She'd grown up in a middle-class Jewish family where people followed rules and worked legitimate jobs. Henry's world was completely different, exciting, dangerous, glamorous in a way that legitimate life could never be. There's a famous scene in Goodfellas that recreates this experience. Henry, played by Ray Liotta, takes Karen, played by Lorraine Bracco, the Copacabana. The camera follows them in a single unbroken shot as they enter through the kitchen, walk through corridors full of activity, emerge into the main room, and sit down at a table that's literally carried in and set up for them. The shot is justly famous for its technical execution, but what it's really showing is the power and privilege that came with being connected to the mob. That scene was based on Karen's real experience. That's what life was like when you were with a mobster. You were treated like royalty. You never waited. You never paid full price. You never had to deal with the inconveniences that regular people faced. Henry and Karen got married. They moved into a house. They started a family. Karen gave birth to their daughter, and later their son. From the outside, they looked like a successful young couple living the American dream. But underneath all that glamour was violence, constant, brutal violence. Henry learned the two most important rules of mob life early, and Paul Vario and Jimmy Burke drilled them into his head constantly. Never rat on your friends, and always keep your mouth shut. These weren't just suggestions. These weren't guidelines that you could bend if circumstances demanded it. These were commandments, absolutely inviolable laws that you followed no matter what. If you got arrested, you kept your mouth shut. You didn't talk to the police. You didn't cooperate with prosecutors. You didn't testify against anyone. You did your time, and when you got out, you were welcomed back with respect, and often with financial compensation for the years you'd lost. But if you talked, if you became an informant, if you cooperated, if you testified, you were marked for death. Not just you, but potentially your family as well. There was no forgiveness for rats, no statute of limitations. You could run to the other side of the world, and they'd still find you eventually. This code of silence, omerta, was what held the entire organization together. If people felt free to cooperate with law enforcement whenever they got arrested, the mob would fall apart. So the consequences for violating omerta had to be severe enough to outweigh even the threat of spending decades in prison. Throughout the late 1960s, Henry watched as people who talked too much, who were suspected of cooperating with police, who couldn't be trusted to keep their mouths shut, simply disappeared. They'd be there one day and gone the next. Sometimes their bodies would be found in car trunks, in shallow graves, floating in rivers. Sometimes they were never found at all. Henry participated in some of this violence, though usually not as the primary actor. He helped dispose of bodies. He helped clean up crime scenes. He provided alibis for other members of the crew when they committed murders. He was an accomplice, a facilitator, making him legally culpable, even if he wasn't pulling the trigger himself. But being a mobster wasn't just about the violence. It was also about the lifestyle, the respect, the sense of belonging to something larger than yourself. Henry felt like he was part of a family, a twisted, violent family, but a family nonetheless. These men had his back. They'd go to prison before they'd rat him out. They'd share their money with him when he was down. They'd celebrate his successes. That sense of belonging was powerful. For someone like Henry, who'd grown up feeling like an outsider in his own family because of his mixed heritage, who'd never felt fully accepted in either the Irish or Italian communities, the mob gave him a place where he belonged absolutely. By 1970, Henry Hill was a fully established member of Paul Vario's crew. He was 30 years old, not young anymore, but still in his prime. He owned a bar in Queens, called The Suite, which served as both a legitimate business and a front for illegal activities. He was making serious money from multiple criminal enterprises. His wife Karen was living well, raising their children, participating in the mob lifestyle, even as she tried to maintain some normalcy for their kids. Henry had the house. He had the car. He had the clothes. He had the respect. He had everything he'd wanted since he was 11 years old, looking across the street at Paul Vario's cab stand. Everything seemed to be going well. And then, on a night in June of 1970, a made man named Billy Batts came home from prison. There was a welcome home party at Henry's bar, The Suite, and during that party, Billy Batts made a comment to Tommy DeSimone that would set off a chain of events that would eventually destroy everything. William Benvena, known to everyone as Billy Batts, was a made man in the Gambino crime family, one of New York's 5 families. Being a made man gave Billy a certain status, a certain protection. Made men were untouchable. You couldn't kill a made man without permission from the boss of his family. This was one of the few absolute rules in organized crime. Break that rule, and you signed your own death warrant. Kill a made man without permission, and your own family would be expected to give you up for execution, to maintain peace between the families. The rule existed to prevent endless cycles of revenge killings between families, to maintain a kind of order in the underworld. Billy Batts had been in prison for 6 years, from 1964 to 1970, serving time for drug trafficking or extortion. The exact charge is unclear from historical records. While he was locked up, the world had continued without him. His criminal enterprises had been taken over by others. His territory had been absorbed. His status had diminished. But now, in June of 1970, Billy Batts was out. He was a free man, back on the streets, ready to reclaim what was his and reestablish himself in the mob hierarchy. There was a welcome home party for Billy at the Suite, Henry Hill's bar in Queens. These kinds of parties were common in mob culture. A show of respect for a guy who'd done his time without cooperating. A celebration of his return. An opportunity for everyone to reconnect and reaffirm relationships. The party was crowded. Lots of wise guys from different crews. Lots of alcohol. Lots of loud conversation and laughter. It was a good time. A celebration. Tommy DeSimone was there. And at some point during the evening, Billy Batts saw Tommy. They knew each other from years ago, from before Billy went to prison, and Billy, probably feeling good from the alcohol and the celebration, probably wanting to reconnect with old acquaintances, said something to Tommy. "Go home and get your shine box," Billy said. Laughing, it was a reference to Tommy's youth, to a time when Tommy had shined shoes. Maybe Billy had seen Tommy shining shoes when they were both younger. Maybe it was just a general reference to Tommy being young and low-level back in the early 1960s. Either way, it was meant as a joke, as ball-busting, as the kind of good-natured ribbing that was common among wise guys. But Tommy didn't see it as good-natured. Tommy never saw anything as good-natured. The entire room went quiet. People who knew Tommy, who understood his temper, immediately recognized that something was wrong. They could see it on Tommy's face, the rage building, the violence coiling up inside him like a spring being compressed. But Tommy couldn't do anything. Not right then, not in front of everyone. Billy Batts was a made man in the Gambino family. Tommy was just an associate in the Lucchese family. Attacking a made man in public, at a party, would bring down consequences on the entire Lucchese family. Tommy would be killed immediately. And Paul Vario might be killed too for not controlling his people. So Tommy swallowed his rage. He smiled. He laughed it off. He pretended like it was no big deal. But inside, Tommy was planning. Tommy never forgot an insult. Never. And there was another issue beyond the insult. Before Billy Batts went to prison, he'd been running a loan shark operation, lending money at exorbitant interest rates to gamblers and businessmen who couldn't get loans elsewhere. When Billy went away, someone had to take over that operation, and the someone who did was Jimmy Burke. For 6 years, Burke had been running Billy's loan shark business and keeping all the profits. He'd been collecting from Billy's customers, lending to new customers, building up the operation. Now that Billy was out, he wanted his business back. He wanted his customers back. And he probably wanted compensation for the 6 years of profits that Burke had collected. Jimmy Burke didn't want to give it up. This was lucrative business. And Burke had been treating it as his own for years. The idea of handing it back to Billy Batts, of losing that income stream, of paying Billy for lost profits, that didn't sit well with Burke at all. So Jimmy and Tommy started planning. They talked about it over the next couple weeks. They considered their options. And they came to a decision. Billy Batts had to die. It was a risky decision. Billy was a made man. Killing him without permission from the Gambino family would bring retaliation. But Jimmy and Tommy convinced themselves that they could get away with it. They'd make the body disappear completely. Nobody would know what happened. Billy would just vanish. And people would assume he'd run off somewhere or gotten himself in trouble with someone else. On June 11th, 1970, coincidentally, this was Henry Hill's 27th birthday. Billy Batts was back at the suite for another gathering. The bar was busy. People were drinking and talking. It seemed like a normal night at some point. Tommy approached Billy and started talking to him. The conversation seemed casual at first. Maybe they were talking about old times, about people they both knew, about what had changed in the 6 years Billy was away. Then, without warning, Tommy pulled out a gun and smashed it into the side of Billy's head. Billy went down hard, blood immediately pouring from the wound. Jimmy Burke appeared instantly, like he'd been waiting for the signal. He started kicking Billy in the head, brutal stomping kicks that continued even after Billy had stopped moving. Tommy joined in, both of them beating Billy with fists and feet and the pistol, hitting him over and over long after it was clear he was unconscious. The other people in the bar scrambled to get out of the way. This was mob business, and you didn't want to be a witness to mob business. You looked away. You forgot what you saw. You kept your mouth shut. After several minutes of brutal beating, Billy Batts was lying motionless in a pool of his own blood. His face was a mess. Broken nose, broken jaw, teeth knocked out, eyes swollen shut. He looked dead. "Come on," Jimmy said. "We need to get rid of him." They wrapped Billy's body in tablecloths and carried him out to the trunk of Henry's car. Henry had been standing there watching, frozen in shock and horror. This was his bar. This was his birthday. And now he was an accessory to the murder of a made man. They loaded the body into the trunk. Henry drove, with Tommy and Jimmy following in another vehicle. The plan was to take Billy to a remote location and bury him deep enough that he'd never be found. But as they were driving through Queens, heading toward a location Jimmy had picked out, they heard something. A sound from the trunk, thumping, banging. A muffled voice trying to scream. Billy Batts was still alive. "Pull over," Jimmy said when they called him on the radio they were using to communicate between vehicles. They were on a remote road at this point. No traffic, no witnesses. They stopped the cars and opened the trunk. Billy Batts was moving weakly, trying to get free of the tablecloths wrapped around him, making horrible sounds through his broken mouth. He'd survived the beating, somehow, despite massive head trauma, despite being unconscious for an extended period. Billy Batts was still alive, but not for long. "We need to finish this properly," Jimmy said. "We need supplies." They drove to Tommy's mother's house. Tommy went inside while the others waited in the car, with the still-living Billy Batts in the trunk. Tommy's mother asked what he needed. "We hit a deer," Tommy told her. "I need a knife to gut it, and a shovel to bury it." His mother, probably suspecting the truth, but knowing better than to ask questions, gave him what he needed. She also gave him some lime, which could be used to accelerate decomposition. Then they drove to a remote location. Exactly where has never been confirmed, but it was probably somewhere in Queens or Brooklyn, an undeveloped area where they could dig without being observed. They opened the trunk again. Billy was weaker now, barely conscious, losing blood. Tommy took the knife his mother had given him and started stabbing. He stabbed Billy 30 to 40 times, hitting him in the chest, the stomach, the back, anywhere he could reach. Jimmy participated too, both of them stabbing until there was absolutely no doubt that Billy Batts was dead. Then they dug. They dug a hole deep enough to bury a body, deep enough that it wouldn't be found by animals or by construction crews. They dumped Billy's body in the hole, covered him with lime to speed decomposition and mask the smell, and filled in the hole. They buried him under a dog kennel in a remote area. The theory was that if anyone ever did dig there and found bones, they'd assume they were dog bones from the kennel, not human remains. For 3 months after that night, everything seemed fine. Nobody asked about Billy Batts. Nobody reported him missing. The Gambino family didn't come looking for him. Maybe they figured he'd skipped town. Maybe they thought he was hiding from someone. Maybe they just didn't care that much about a guy who'd been away for 6 years and wasn't particularly close to the current leadership. Tommy, Jimmy, and Henry started to think they'd gotten away with it. They'd killed a made man, broken one of the most sacred rules in organized crime, and there had been no consequences. But then, approximately 3 months later, the property with the dog kennel was sold to developers. They were going to build houses or a shopping center or something on that land. That meant construction crews would be digging. That meant Billy Batts' body would be discovered. Jimmy got word about the development deal through his connections. He immediately realized they had a problem. If construction workers found a body, there would be police investigation, forensic analysis, identification. It would be traced back to Billy Batts, and then the Gambino family would know what happened. They had to dig up the body and move it. This had to be one of the worst nights of Henry Hill's life. Going back to that dog kennel 3 months later, digging up a body that had been decomposing in the ground, the smell must have been unbearable. Rotting flesh, bodily fluids, The chemical smell of lime. The sight must have been nightmarish. A corpse that was no longer recognizable as human. Bloated and discolored and falling apart. They got the body out of the ground. They wrapped it in more tarps and blankets. And then they had to figure out what to do with it. According to Henry Hill's later testimony, they drove the body to a car compactor in New Jersey. They placed it inside a car, and then the entire car, with Billy Bat's remains inside, was crushed into a cube of metal and organic matter. The cube was loaded onto a truck with other crushed cars and taken to a scrapyard, where it would eventually be melted down. Billy Bat's body became part of the steel recycling stream. His remains were literally turned into building materials, car parts, appliances. He was scattered across the industrial infrastructure of America. Other accounts suggest the body might have been buried under Robert's Lounge, Jimmy Burke's bar in Queens, where other bodies were buried in the basement. Some sources suggest the body was dissolved in acid. Others suggest it was buried in a different location. The truth is, nobody knows for sure what happened to Billy Bat's remains. William Benfina is officially a missing person. His case has never been solved. His family never had a body to bury, never had closure, but everyone in the mob knew he was dead, and everyone in the mob knew who killed him, Tommy DeSimone and Jimmy Burke. With Henry Hill as an accomplice, this murder, this violation of the sacred rule against killing made men without permission, set off a chain of events that would take years to fully unfold. The Gambino family didn't forget John Gotti, who was rising through the ranks of the Gambino family at the time. Didn't forget, and eventually there would be payback. But that was years away. In 1970, Tommy and Jimmy thought they'd gotten away with murder. And in the meantime, there were more crimes to commit, more money to make, and for Tommy DeSimone, more people to kill, because Tommy's appetite for violence was insatiable. And his next victim would be a young bartender named Spider. Michael Janko, known to everyone as Spider, was a young man in his early 20s who worked as a bartender at Robert's Lounge in Queens. He was a low-level associate in Jimmy Burke's crew, doing odd jobs, running errands, hoping to work his way up in the organization and eventually become a real earner. Spider was friendly, eager to please, generally well-liked by the people he worked with. He wasn't a tough guy or a hardened criminal. He was just a young man trying to make a living in the only world he knew, the world of organized crime in Queens. Spider made one critical mistake. He was around Tommy DeSimone on a regular basis. One night, the exact date is uncertain, but it was probably in 1974 or 1975. A group from the crew was at Robert's Lounge. It was a typical evening. They were drinking, playing cards, telling stories, relaxing after whatever crimes they'd committed that day. Spider was working behind the bar, serving drinks, cleaning glasses, trying to stay out of the way and not attract attention. At some point during the evening, Tommy asked Spider to bring him a drink. Maybe Tommy wanted a beer, or a mixed drink, or a shot of whiskey. The specifics don't matter. Spider forgot. Maybe he was busy serving other people. Maybe he didn't hear Tommy over the noise in the bar. Maybe someone else asked him for something and he got distracted. Maybe he just forgot. These things happen when you're bartending. You can't remember every single request from every single customer, especially when you're busy. But Tommy DeSimone took it as a sign of disrespect. In Tommy's paranoid, narcissistic worldview, forgetting his drink wasn't just a mistake. It was an insult. It meant Spider didn't respect him enough to prioritize his request. It meant Spider was treating him like he didn't matter. Dance! Tommy yelled at Spider, suddenly furious. Spider looked confused. What? Dance, you motherfucker, dance! Then Tommy pulled out his .22 caliber pistol and shot Spider in the foot. The gunshot was loud even in the noisy bar. Everyone stopped what they were doing. Spider screamed and collapsed. Grabbing his foot, blood was pouring out. The bullet had gone straight through, shattering bones, tearing through muscle and tissue. The other guys in the crew were stunned. Even for Tommy, this seemed extreme. The kid had just forgotten a drink. He wasn't disrespecting Tommy deliberately. He wasn't trying to cause problems. He was just a young bartender who'd made a minor mistake. Jimmy Burke was angry, not necessarily at the shooting itself. Violence was just part of the life, but at the complications it created. Now they had to take Spider to a doctor they trusted, someone who wouldn't report a gunshot wound to the police. Now they had to explain this to Paul Vario. Now they had to deal with the aftermath. "Jesus Christ, Tommy," Jimmy said. "What the fuck is wrong with you?" But Tommy just laughed. He thought it was funny. He'd shot a kid in the foot for forgetting his drink. And he thought it was hilarious. They got Spider medical attention. The bullet had done serious damage, shattered bones, damaged nerves. Spider would need surgery, would need weeks of recovery. But he survived, and when he was well enough, he came back to work at Robert's Lounge, because what else could he do? You don't quit the mob because someone shot you. You don't file a police report. You don't sue for damages. You just accept that this is part of the life. That violence is always a possibility, that you got unlucky. Spider came back to work with his foot in a cast, limping badly, clearly still in pain. But he came back. He needed the money. He needed to stay connected, and maybe, on some level, he hoped that the shooting had satisfied Tommy's anger, that Tommy was done with him now. He was wrong. A few weeks after Spider returned to work, the crew was at Robert's Lounge again. Similar scene, drinking, card games, conversation. Spider was behind the bar, doing his job, trying to stay invisible. Tommy was there again and again. Tommy said something to Spider. Maybe he insulted him. Maybe he mocked him for getting shot. Maybe he made fun of his limp. Tommy seemed to take pleasure in reminding Spider that he'd shot him, in making sure Spider never forgot who had the power in this relationship. And Spider, who had been shot for forgetting a drink, who had suffered through weeks of pain and recovery, who was probably tired of being abused and humiliated, finally snapped. He talked back. "Why don't you go fuck yourself, Tommy?" The moment the words left Spider's mouth, he probably realized his mistake. You could see it in the way the room went silent. Every conversation stopped. Every card game froze. Everyone looked at Tommy, waiting to see what would happen. Henry Hill, who was there that night, later described the feeling in the room. We all knew. We all knew right then that Spider was dead. Tommy stood up slowly. He looked at Spider with an expression that combined rage, contempt, and maybe a hint of satisfaction. Because now he had an excuse. Now he had a justification for doing what he probably wanted to do from the beginning. Tommy pulled out his gun and shot Spider in the chest. 3 times, Spider collapsed behind the bar, dead before he hit the floor. Blood spread across the floor. Pooling around his body, Jimmy Burke exploded. "What the fuck are you doing?" He yelled at Tommy. "What the fuck is wrong with you?" We needed him. He worked for us. But it was too late. Spider was dead, another body. Another mess to clean up. Another witness eliminated. Another person who knew too much removed from the equation. Except Spider hadn't known too much. He hadn't been involved in any major crimes. He hadn't witnessed anything particularly incriminating. He was just a bartender who'd made the mistake of being in Tommy DeSimone's orbit. They buried Spider's body. The exact location has never been confirmed with absolute certainty. But the prevailing theory is that he was buried in the basement of Robert's Lounge, where Jimmy Burke buried many of his victims. Other theories suggest he was taken to the same remote areas where other bodies were disposed of. Possibly the Hole, a marshy area near JFK Airport that the mob used as a dumping ground. Michael Junko was 23 years old when Tommy DeSimone murdered him. His family reported him missing. His mother waited for him to come home, never knowing that her son had been shot to death over a moment of backtalk, that his body had been buried like garbage, that the people who killed him would never face consequences. This murder was dramatized in Goodfellas, in one of the film's most memorable and disturbing scenes. Joe Pesci's performance captures the sudden, explosive violence of the moment, the scene where Tommy shoots Spider, where Jimmy Burke, played by Robert De Niro, reacts with anger and frustration, where Henry Hill, Ray Liotta, helps dispose of the body. It's all based on what really happened, but in the movie, there's a kind of dark humor to the scene. It's presented as shocking, but also somehow inevitable. Part of the rhythm of mob life. In real life, there was no humor. Just a young man dying on a dirty floor in Queens because a psychopath felt disrespected. Tommy DeSimone was never punished for killing Spider. Paul Vario heard about it. Jimmy Burke complained about it. But nothing happened to Tommy. In the mob, some people are too valuable, too connected, or too dangerous to punish for killing nobodies like Spider. But every murder has consequences. Every body buried is a secret that could destroy you. Every act of violence creates enemies and witnesses and complications. And Tommy DeSimone was accumulating these consequences faster than anyone could keep track of. He'd killed a made man in Billy Bats. He'd killed numerous other people. Some estimates put his personal body count at 20 or more murders. He'd made enemies throughout the New York underworld. He'd violated rules and crossed lines that even hardened mobsters thought were too far. Eventually, there would be a reckoning. But in the mid-1970s, Tommy was still operating with apparent impunity. He was still part of Paul Vario's crew. He was still working jobs with Jimmy Burke and Henry Hill. And together, these three men were about to become involved in the biggest heist in American history. A heist that would make them all rich, and that would ultimately lead to more murders than anyone could count. Martin Krugman was not your typical mobster. He ran a beauty salon, a wig shop in Queens. And he was a bookmaker on the side. Krugman took illegal bets on sports. Horse races, anything people wanted to gamble on. He wasn't a tough guy. He wasn't particularly feared or respected. He was just a businessman who operated on the fringes of organized crime. Making a living however he could, but Martin Krugman had connections. He knew people, and in 1978, one of those connections was about to change everything. Louis Werner was one of Krugman's regular gambling clients. Werner worked at the Lufthansa cargo terminal at JFK Airport as a cargo supervisor. He was a middle-aged man with a wife and family, living in the Long Island suburbs, working a legitimate job. But Werner had a problem, a serious gambling problem. He'd been betting on sports for years. And like most gamblers, he lost far more than he won. The bookies he owed money to were getting impatient. Werner owed approximately $20,000, a massive debt in 1978, worth probably $100,000 or more in today's money. His creditors were making threats. His family was at risk. He was desperate. Werner knew something that could solve his debt problem. He knew that several times a month, Lufthansa received shipments of untraceable American currency that had been exchanged at banks overseas. When Americans traveling in Europe exchanged their dollars for local currency, those dollars accumulated in European banks. Periodically, these banks would ship the accumulated currency back to the United States through Lufthansa cargo flights. These shipments were valuable, sometimes millions of dollars in cash, and they passed through the Lufthansa cargo terminal at JFK, where security was minimal. The alarm systems were outdated. Dating back to the 1960s, the vault where the cash was stored was accessible. The guards were few and not particularly well trained. The whole operation was vulnerable to anyone who knew when the shipments were coming and had the manpower to pull off a robbery. Werner went to Martin Krugman with this information. He explained the situation, explained the opportunity, explained how it could work. Krugman immediately understood the implications. This wasn't some small-time score. This was potentially millions of dollars. But it was also way beyond anything Krugman could organize himself. He needed to bring this to someone with experience in major heists. Someone with the resources and the crew to actually pull it off. Krugman knew exactly who to talk to. Jimmy Burke. Jimmy Burke had been planning and executing heists for decades. He was the acknowledged master of airport robberies in New York. He'd pulled off the Air France robbery in the 1960s. He'd orchestrated countless truck hijackings. He knew JFK Airport better than almost anyone in the criminal world. If anyone could plan and execute a robbery of this magnitude, it was Jimmy Burke. Krugman approached Burke. Probably at Robert's Lounge, probably over drinks, probably with some nervousness, because you don't bring a bad idea to Jimmy Burke. But this wasn't a bad idea. This was potentially the greatest score of Burke's career. When Burke heard the details, his eyes lit up. $6 million. Maybe more. Untraceable cash. Minimal security. An inside man who could provide crucial information. This was the heist he'd been waiting for his entire criminal life. This was the one big score that could set him up forever. But Burke couldn't just decide to rob Lufthansa on his own. In the mob, there are rules, there are protocols. You need permission for major operations, especially if they're going to happen on another family's territory. JFK Airport was primarily Bonanno family territory. The Bonannos controlled many of the rackets at the airport, had connections with the unions, had their own operations going. If Burke, who was associated with the Lucchese family, was going to pull off a major heist at JFK, he needed to get approval from the Bonanno leadership and agree to give them their cut. Burke reached out through intermediaries. He explained the opportunity. He negotiated the terms. The Bonannos would get a percentage, probably somewhere between 10 and 20% of the total take. In exchange, they wouldn't interfere, and they'd provide whatever assistance Burke needed in terms of access or information. The Bonannos agreed. Burke also needed permission from his own boss, Paul Vario. Vario was technically semi-retired by 1978, spending much of his time in Florida, enjoying the millions he'd accumulated over decades of crime. But he was still the captain, still the boss of the crew. Nothing major happened without his approval. Burke called Vario in Florida and explained the opportunity, a potential $6 million heist. Minimal risk if planned properly. Everyone involved would get rich. Vario gave his blessing immediately. How could he not? This was the kind of score you dream about. Now Burke needed to assemble the crew. This was crucial. He needed people he could trust, or at least people he could control. He needed people with specific skills. He needed inside information, drivers, gunmen, and people to help move the stolen goods afterward. He needed people who could keep their mouths shut if things went wrong. The crew came together over several weeks in the fall of 1978. Tommy DeSimone would be one of the gunmen. Despite his psychotic tendencies and his history of unnecessary violence, Tommy was reliable when it came to intimidation and robbery. He wouldn't hesitate, wouldn't freeze, wouldn't show mercy if someone tried to be a hero, and Tommy needed money. He'd been spending heavily on cocaine and living beyond his means. Angelo Seep would be another gunman. Seep was a violent criminal who'd worked with Burke before on various jobs. He was fearless and ruthless, exactly the type of person you wanted on a heist. Louis Caffra would drive the van. Caffra was an experienced wheelman who knew how to drive fast, how to evade pursuit, and how to stay calm under pressure. Joseph Joe Buda, Manry, would help with security and logistics inside the terminal. Manry had experience with armed robberies, and knew how to control a situation. Paolo Licastri, nicknamed Paul Mazzei, would help fence the stolen goods, particularly the jewelry that might be in the cargo terminal, along with the cash. Licastri had connections to fences throughout New York and could move hot merchandise quickly. Robert "Frenchie" McMahon would be involved in planning and logistics. McMahon was one of Burke's most trusted associates. Parnell Stacks Edwards would be responsible for disposing of the getaway van after the robbery. His job was simple but crucial. Drive the van to a prearranged location, torch it, make sure it could never be traced back to the crew. Edwards was a small-time criminal, not particularly bright, but Burke thought he could handle this simple task. Even Jimmy Burke's son, Frank Burke, would be involved as backup. He'd wait in a separate car, ready to assist if anything went wrong during the getaway. And of course, Louis Werner, the inside man, would provide the crucial information about when the shipments were coming, what security measures would be in place, and where exactly the money would be stored inside the terminal. Each member of the crew was promised a cut ranging from $10,000 to $50,000. Depending on their role and their level of involvement, it wasn't an equal split. Burke was planning to keep the bulk of the money for himself, naturally, but it was enough to make everyone involved rich by their standards. Werner, the inside man who made it all possible, was promised $300,000. This would solve his gambling debt problems and set him up nicely. All he had to do was provide information and make sure certain security protocols weren't followed on the night of the robbery. Throughout November and December of 1978, the crew planned meticulously. They studied the layout of the Lufthansa terminal. They learned the schedules of the guards and the workers. They figured out the alarm systems and how to bypass them. They planned their entry route and multiple escape routes. They rehearsed what they would say to the employees, how they would control the situation, how they would move the money quickly. Werner provided inside information about when the next big shipment would arrive. The currency came from European banks, accumulated over weeks or months of transactions. The shipments were irregular, sometimes every few weeks, sometimes every few months. But Werner had access to the shipping schedules. He knew when the next big load was coming. December 11th, 1978. That was the date. A Monday morning, very early, when the terminal would be minimally staffed, but the money would be in the vault, waiting to be processed and distributed. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. They would arrive before dawn. When most of the city was still asleep, they'd enter the terminal through a door that Werner would make sure was accessible. They'd hold the employees at gunpoint. There would only be a handful of people working the night shift. They'd take the money and any other valuables they could find. They'd be in and out in less than an hour. The van would be disposed of immediately, and everyone would go their separate ways. Each member of the crew would lay low for a while. No big purchases, no flashy displays of wealth, no behavior that would attract attention. They'd let the heat die down. Then, gradually, they'd launder the money through various legitimate businesses and spend it carefully over time. It was a good plan, a solid plan, the kind of plan that had made Jimmy Burke a legendary heist man. But there was one thing the crew didn't fully understand. Jimmy Burke was already planning what would happen after the heist, and his plan involved making sure that as few people as possible lived to spend their share of the money. Burke had learned over decades of crime that the biggest risk in any heist wasn't the heist itself. It was the aftermath. People got drunk and talked. People bought expensive things and attracted attention. People got arrested for other crimes and decided to cooperate with prosecutors to reduce their sentences. The only way to guarantee that people wouldn't talk was to make sure they couldn't talk. Permanently, Burke was already making a list in his head. Who could be trusted? Who was a liability? Who knew too much? Who would need to be eliminated once the money was secured? But the crew didn't know this. They thought they were all in this together, that they'd all get rich together, that this would be the beginning of a new chapter in their criminal careers. They had no idea they were signing their own death warrants. December 11th, 1978. The date was set. The plan was ready. All they had to do was execute. December 11th, 1978. Monday morning, 3:17 a.m., a black van pulls up to the Lufthansa cargo terminal at Building 261, JFK Airport. The temperature is just above freezing. Frost covers the tarmac and the roofs of buildings. The entire airport is quiet. Commercial flights don't start arriving until later in the morning, and the cargo operations are minimal during the night shift. 6 men get out of the van, all wearing ski masks, all carrying guns. Some have pistols, some have shotguns. They move quickly, purposefully, like they've rehearsed this 100 times, because they have Tommy DeSimone, Angelo Seep, Joe Manry, Louis Cafara, and 2 others. Jimmy Burke isn't with them. He's too smart to actually participate in the robbery itself. If something goes wrong, if someone gets arrested, Burke doesn't want to be directly connected to the crime. He's waiting nearby, ready to collect the money once the job is done. The crew approaches the employee entrance. According to Louis Werner's information, this door should be accessible, either unlocked or easy to breach. Werner had promised that he'd make sure security protocols were deliberately lax tonight. The door opens easily. They're inside. The Lufthansa cargo terminal is a large, industrial building filled with cargo containers, forklifts, conveyor belts, and office spaces. During the day, it's bustling with activity. Workers processing shipments, trucks coming and going, supervisors checking inventories. But at 3:17 a.m. on a Monday morning, there are only a handful of people working the night shift. The crew bursts into the main work area, guns drawn, shouting commands. Everyone on the ground. Now, put your hands on your head. Don't move. Don't be a fucking hero. The employees, maybe 5 or 6 people total, comply immediately. Some of them probably heard stories about airport robberies. Some of them probably thought it would never happen to them. But now it's happening, and they're not going to risk their lives to protect Lufthansa's money. Tommy DeSimone and Angelo Seep hold the employees at gunpoint while the others search for the vault. Louis Werner had provided detailed information about where the cash would be stored. He'd explained the layout, the security systems, the procedures, everything the crew needed to know. They find the vault. It's not some high-tech, impenetrable fortress. It's just a secured room with a combination lock. And thanks to Werner's information, they know how to bypass it, or they force one of the employees to open it. The door opens inside. There are stacks and stacks of cash. Bundles of $100 bills, $50 bills, 20s, 10s, more money than any of them have ever seen in one place. The sight must have been incredible. The culmination of months of planning, millions of dollars just sitting there waiting to be taken. They work quickly, loading the cash into duffel bags, into boxes, into anything they can carry. They're moving as fast as they can, because every minute they stay increases the risk. But they can't help being amazed at how much money there is. In addition to the cash, they find jewelry, expensive watches, diamond rings, gold chains. These had been in transit through the cargo terminal, being shipped for various commercial purposes. The crew grabs the jewelry too. Why not? It's valuable, and it's right there. The employees are kept on the ground, faces down, hands on their heads. The crew members watching them are constantly scanning for signs of heroism, for anyone reaching for an alarm or trying to signal for help. But the employees are smart. They stay still. They stay quiet. They want to survive this 64 minutes. That's how long the crew is inside the Lufthansa terminal. Just over an hour. In that time, they load approximately $5 million in cash and $875,000 in jewelry into the van. The total haul is approximately $6 million, the largest cash robbery in American history at that time. Before they leave, they give the employees a final warning. Don't move for 10 minutes. Don't call anyone. Don't touch the alarms. If you do, we'll know, and we'll come back for you. It's probably an empty threat. The crew isn't coming back, but it's enough to make the employees wait before raising the alarm. The crew exits the building, loads into the van, and drives away from the terminal. The getaway is clean. No police sirens, no pursuit, no complications. They exit the airport property and head toward their prearranged meeting location. The van drives to an auto body shop in Canarsie, Brooklyn, a shop that's friendly to the mob, where they can work without being observed. They pull inside, close the door, and unload their haul. The sight of all that cash spread out must have been intoxicating. Millions of dollars, clean bills, untraceable, ready to be spent or laundered. This is what they'd worked for. This is what they'd risked everything for. Jimmy Burke and his son Frank arrived shortly after. Burke had been waiting nearby, monitoring police radio frequencies, making sure everything went according to plan. Now he's here to take charge of the money. The crew divides up some of the cash on the spot. Each person gets their initial cut, enough to prove that this is real, that they've actually pulled it off. The rest will be distributed later, once the heat dies down. Once they're sure there's no immediate danger of arrest, Burke and Frank load the bulk of the money into their car. They'll take it to a secure location, probably multiple locations actually, spreading it around so that no single stash can be seized if something goes wrong. Burke is meticulous about this. He's not going to lose this money to a police raid or a betrayal. The crew is told to dispose of the van immediately and then go home. Act natural. Don't do anything unusual. Don't make any big purchases. Don't tell anyone about the heist. Just go home, go to sleep, and wait for further instructions. Stax Edwards is given one job: dispose of the van. Drive it to a junkyard. Torch it. Make sure it can never be traced back to anyone. It's a simple job. It should take maybe an hour. Tops, the crew disperses. Everyone goes their separate ways, heading back to their homes and their regular lives. They're rich. They've pulled off the impossible. The largest cash robbery in American history, and they got away clean. They celebrate briefly, maybe a drink or two, maybe some quiet congratulations with trusted friends. But mostly, they're smart enough to lay low. You don't throw a party after pulling off a $6 million heist. By the time the sun rises on December 11, 1978, the crew is scattered throughout New York. The money is hidden. The van is supposed to be destroyed. Everything seems to have gone perfectly. At approximately 8:30 a.m., the day shift arrives at the Lufthansa cargo terminal. They find the night shift employees shaken and terrified, still recovering from being held at gunpoint for over an hour. They find the vault empty. They find evidence of the robbery everywhere. The police are called, then the FBI, then Lufthansa executives, within hours. Dozens of law enforcement officers are processing the crime scene, interviewing witnesses, gathering evidence. The FBI immediately recognizes this as a major heist, probably organized crime related. They know it had to be an inside job. The robbers knew too much, had too much information, moved too efficiently through the terminal. They start investigating Lufthansa employees, looking for anyone with financial problems, anyone with criminal connections, anyone who might have helped plan the robbery. And they find Louis Werner almost immediately. His gambling debts are a matter of record. His connections to Martin Krugman are discoverable. Within days, the FBI has identified Werner as the inside man. But Werner isn't talking. He denies everything. Without hard evidence connecting him to the robbery, they can't arrest him yet, but they're watching him closely. The FBI also knows that this kind of heist, this level of planning and execution, points to experienced organized crime figures. They start looking at known criminals, who specialize in airport robberies. And very quickly, one name keeps coming up: Jimmy Burke. Burke's crew had been under surveillance before. They were known to be involved in airport crimes. They had the expertise to pull this off, and several informants. Criminals looking to reduce their own sentences mention Burke's name in connection with the Lufthansa heist. Within 3 days of the robbery, the FBI knows who did it. They don't have enough evidence to make arrests yet, but they know. They put Burke and his entire crew under intensive surveillance. Helicopters follow them. Wiretaps are installed on their phones. Undercover agents watch their houses, their hangouts, their regular haunts. And Jimmy Burke knows that the FBI knows. He can see the helicopters. He can spot the surveillance cars. He knows his phone is probably tapped. He knows that law enforcement is building a case against him. Burke's response is characteristically ruthless. Kill everyone involved in the heist. If they're dead, they can't testify. If they're dead, they can't make mistakes that lead police to evidence. If they're dead, the case against Burke falls apart. And there's another factor. Burke wants to keep all the money for himself. If he kills everyone who's owed a share, he doesn't have to pay them. $6 million doesn't have to be divided among a dozen people. It can be all his. Jimmy Burke's paranoia and his greed combined to create one of the bloodiest aftermaths of any heist in American history. Parnell Stax Edwards made the first fatal mistake. After the robbery, his job was simple: dispose of the van, drive it to a prearranged location, pour gasoline inside, light it on fire, walk away. The van would be found eventually, but it would be burned beyond any forensic usefulness. No fingerprints, no hair samples, no evidence connecting it to anyone. Stax Edwards was supposed to do this immediately after the robbery. Instead, he drove to his girlfriend's apartment in Ozone Park, Queens. He parked the van right in front of the building, in front of a fire hydrant, where it was clearly visible from the street, where any passing police officer would notice it and probably write a ticket. And then Stax went inside his girlfriend's apartment and went to sleep. He was tired. The robbery had been exhausting. He'd been up all night. He figured he'd rest for a few hours and dispose of the van later. It was a catastrophic mistake. The van was discovered within hours. A parking enforcement officer noticed it in front of the fire hydrant and called for it to be towed. When the tow truck arrived, someone noticed that the van matched the description of the vehicle used in the Lufthansa heist. The police were called. The FBI was called. The van was immediately impounded and processed as evidence. FBI forensic teams went through it meticulously. They found fingerprints, lots of fingerprints. They found hair samples. They found fibers from clothing. They found tire tracks that could be matched to specific locations. Most importantly, they found evidence that led directly to Jimmy Burke's crew. The fingerprints matched known criminals who were associated with Burke. The van had been stolen from a location connected to Burke's operations. Everything pointed directly at Burke and his people within 72 hours of the robbery. 3 days, the FBI had identified most of the crew. They knew who did it. They just needed to build a prosecutable case. Jimmy Burke was informed almost immediately that the van had been found. When he learned that Stax Edwards had parked it in front of a fire hydrant and then gone to sleep instead of destroying it, Burke's rage was apocalyptic. This stupid, lazy mistake had exposed the entire crew. This one act of carelessness had potentially destroyed the greatest score of Burke's career. The FBI was now watching everyone, building a case, getting ready to make arrests. On December 18, 1978, 1 week after the Lufthansa heist, Parnell Stax Edwards was found dead in his apartment. He'd been shot 6 times in the back of the head with a .22 caliber pistol, classic mob execution style. The killer had probably been Tommy DeSimone, though this was never proven in court. Tommy had a habit of shooting people multiple times in the head, and he was Burke's go-to person for murders that needed to happen quickly. Stax Edwards was 28 years old. His mistake had been falling asleep when he should have been working. The price was his life. Stax was the first victim of the post-Lufthansa massacre, but he was far from the last. Jimmy Burke's paranoia was escalating rapidly. The FBI surveillance was constant now. Helicopters followed him during the day. Cars followed him at night. He couldn't make a move without law enforcement knowing about it. And Burke knew that eventually the FBI would have enough evidence to make arrests. They were talking to everyone connected to the heist, offering deals, looking for someone willing to cooperate. Burke decided that the only way to protect himself was to eliminate everyone who could testify against him. Every member of the crew, every person who knew about the heist, every potential witness, all of them had to die. Martin Krugman, the bookmaker who had brought the Lufthansa opportunity to Burke in the first place, was demanding his cut of the money. Krugman had been promised a significant share, probably several $100,000, for connecting Burke with Louis Werner and setting up the heist, but Burke didn't want to pay him. And Burke was worried that Krugman, who was not a hardened criminal, might crack under FBI pressure and cooperate. Krugman started showing up at Robert's lounge. Demanding his money, he was getting angry. Getting loud, making a scene. This was exactly the kind of behavior that Burke couldn't tolerate. In Burke's world, you don't demand anything. You don't make noise. You wait patiently for what you're owed, and you accept whatever you're given. On January 6, 1979, less than a month after the heist, Martin Krugman disappeared. He left his house in the morning, telling his wife he had some business to take care of. He never came home. Krugman's body was never found. He was probably murdered by Tommy DeSimone or one of Burke's other enforcers. His body was probably buried in a remote location or disposed of in a car compactor or dissolved in acid. However it was done, Martin Krugman vanished completely. His wife reported him missing. The FBI investigated, but without a body, without witnesses, without evidence, there was nothing they could do. Martin Krugman became another missing person, another unsolved case. Louis Cafra had driven the van during the robbery. He was an experienced criminal, a trusted associate of Burke's crew. But Burke didn't trust anyone anymore. The paranoia was consuming him. Everyone was a potential informant. Everyone was a potential liability. Cafora and his wife disappeared in early 1979. Their bodies were found weeks later. Both had been murdered, shot in the head, execution style. The message was clear. If you were involved in Lufthansa, you were going to die, and your family might die too. Just to make sure there were no loose ends. Angelo Seep, one of the gunmen during the heist, was killed along with his girlfriend. Seep had been demanding his full share of the money. Just like Krugman, he thought he'd earned it. He thought Burke would honor the agreement they'd made before the robbery. But Jimmy Burke didn't honor agreements. He honored survival, and in Burke's calculation, letting Seep live was a risk not worth taking. Seep and his girlfriend were found shot to death in his girlfriend's apartment. The crime scene suggested they'd been killed quickly, probably by someone they trusted enough to let into the apartment. Paolo Licastri, who was supposed to help fence the stolen jewelry, disappeared. His body was never found. Joe Manry, one of the crew members who'd been inside the terminal during the robbery, was murdered. Robert Frenchy McMahon was killed. One by one, systematically, methodically, Jimmy Burke was eliminating everyone connected to the Lufthansa heist. The bodies piled up throughout 1979 and into 1980. Some were found, many were never recovered. The FBI was investigating a historic robbery that had turned into a massacre, and they were powerless to stop it. Henry Hill watched all of this happening with growing horror. He hadn't been inside the terminal during the robbery. He'd been on the periphery, providing logistical support, helping with planning, but he knew about Lufthansa. He knew who was involved. He'd been close to Burke and Tommy and the rest of the crew for years. And Henry started to realize something terrifying. He was probably next. Jimmy Burke was killing everyone, not just the people directly involved in the robbery, but anyone who knew too much, anyone who could connect Burke to the crime, anyone who might talk if arrested. Henry knew everything. He'd witnessed murders going back years, Billy Bats, Spider, countless others. He'd participated in crimes throughout the 1960s and 70s. He could testify about Paul Vario's operations, about Burke's heists, about the inner workings of the Lucchese crime family. If Burke was eliminating everyone who could talk, Henry was definitely on the list. Henry started noticing things. Burke was asking to meet with him in isolated locations. Burke was suggesting that Henry help with certain jobs that seemed like setups, like traps. Burke's behavior toward Henry had changed, become colder, more distant. Henry started avoiding Burke, making excuses, staying away from Robert's lounge, surrounding himself with other people when he absolutely had to meet with Burke. But Henry had another, even bigger problem. A problem that would ultimately force his hand and change his life forever. Drugs. Henry Hill had been dealing cocaine for years, building a massive drug trafficking operation that Paul Vario had explicitly forbidden. And by 1980, that operation was about to collapse spectacularly. Throughout the 1970s, while Henry Hill was running scores with Jimmy Burke and Tommy DeSimone, while he was participating in hijackings and robberies and all manner of organized crime, he was also building a side business that Paul Vario had explicitly, repeatedly, emphatically forbidden. Drug trafficking. The Mafia's official position on drugs was complicated and hypocritical. Some bosses allowed drug dealing and took their cut of the profits. Others forbade it entirely, seeing it as too risky, too likely to bring heavy law enforcement attention. Paul Vario fell firmly into the latter category. Vario's reasoning was sound. Drug charges brought long prison sentences, much longer than gambling or loan sharking or most other mob rackets. A soldier facing 10 or 20 years in prison for drug trafficking was much more likely to cooperate with prosecutors than someone facing 2 or 3 years for bookmaking. Moreover, drug trafficking attracted federal law enforcement attention. The FBI, federal prosecutors, they all came down hard on drug cases. And federal prosecutors had more resources, better investigators, and more willingness to offer deals to cooperating witnesses than state prosecutors. So Vario's rule was simple. No drugs. Focus on the traditional rackets. Make your money from hijacking, from gambling, from loan sharking, from extortion. Stay away from narcotics. But Henry saw the money that could be made from cocaine. This was the late 1970s. And cocaine was becoming the drug of choice for wealthy Americans. Wall Street traders, entertainment industry people, professional athletes, wealthy suburban couples. They were all using cocaine. The demand was enormous. The profit margins were incredible. A kilogram of cocaine that cost $10,000 wholesale could be cut and sold, retail for $60,000 or $70,000. The math was simple and irresistible, so Henry started dealing. Small at first, selling to friends, to people in his neighborhood, to customers he knew well. But gradually, as he saw how easy it was and how much money he could make, the operation grew. Henry recruited a network of dealers. He established connections with suppliers in Florida who were bringing cocaine in from Colombia and other South American sources. He set up distribution channels throughout New York and Long Island. He built a cocaine empire that was earning him tens of thousands of dollars per week. When Henry went to prison in the mid-1970s on an assault charge, he'd beaten someone badly over a debt or a perceived insult. The exact details are lost to history. His drug operation didn't stop. His wife, Karen, took over some of the logistics. She smuggled cocaine to Henry in prison, hiding it in various ways when she visited. She made deliveries on the outside, collecting money, paying suppliers, keeping the business running. Karen Hill wasn't just a mob wife who looked the other way. She became a full participant in the criminal enterprise. She knew what was happening. She facilitated it. She profited from it. When Henry got out of prison in the late 1970s, the drug business exploded. He was making more money from cocaine than he'd ever made from traditional mob rackets. The cash was flowing in faster than he could count it. He was hiding money all over his house, in his car, in safe deposit boxes with trusted friends. But Henry was also using cocaine heavily himself. This was a major mistake. One of the cardinal rules of drug dealing is, don't get high on your own supply. Dealers who use their own product become addicted, become sloppy, become paranoid and erratic. Henry was snorting cocaine daily by the late 1970s. The drug made him feel invincible, made him confident and energetic. But it also made him paranoid, made him see threats everywhere, made him careless about security. By 1980, Henry Hill was juggling multiple criminal operations simultaneously. He was still doing some work for Paul Vario's crew, participating in hijackings, handling some loan shark collections. He was involved peripherally with the Lufthansa aftermath. He knew what was happening, knew about the murders, knew that Burke was systematically eliminating everyone connected to the heist. And he was running his massive cocaine operation, moving kilograms of product every week, managing a network of dealers and suppliers, making more money than he'd ever imagined. But the whole thing was a house of cards, held together by Henry's increasingly cocaine-addled mind. And on May 11th, 1980, it all came crashing down. Henry later described May 11th, 1980 as the worst day of his life. It was the day everything fell apart. It was the day his carefully constructed criminal empire collapsed. It was the day he lost everything. Henry woke up that morning already paranoid. He'd been using cocaine heavily the night before, and he was coming down hard. He looked out his window and saw a helicopter. It seemed to be circling his neighborhood. It seemed to be following him. Henry convinced himself it was the FBI, or maybe it was Jimmy Burke's people, tracking him before they made their move to kill him. Either way, the helicopter meant danger throughout the day. Henry tried to conduct his business while this helicopter, real or imagined, though it was almost certainly real, followed him everywhere. He had several cocaine deliveries to make. He had dealers waiting for their product. He had money to collect. But he was increasingly convinced that law enforcement was watching him. Henry went to his brother's house to pick up some cocaine that was stashed there. The helicopter followed. He went to check on one of his dealers, a woman named Sandy. The helicopter followed. He drove to a restaurant to meet with a customer. The helicopter followed all day long. While managing his drug operation and trying to evade what he believed was FBI surveillance, Henry was also cooking. He was making his famous tomato sauce, a recipe he'd learned from his mother and perfected over the years, even in the middle of paranoid, cocaine-fueled chaos. Henry was stirring sauce, adding garlic and basil and San Marzano tomatoes, making sure it was perfect. This detail would later become one of the most famous scenes in Goodfellas. The sequence where Henry is running around doing drug deals while helicopters follow him, all while obsessing about his tomato sauce, perfectly captures the manic energy and chaotic lifestyle of Henry's final day of freedom. That evening, Karen became increasingly worried. She was convinced the police were coming. She'd lived with this possibility for years, but now it felt immediate and real. The helicopter, the suspicious cars following them, the tension in Henry's behavior. It all pointed to imminent arrest. Karen made a decision. She went to the bathroom, where they'd been storing a large quantity of cocaine, approximately $60,000 worth, and she flushed it down the toilet. All of it, a fortune in drugs, gone in seconds. Henry was furious when he found out, but he also knew she was probably right. Better to lose the drugs than have them found during a police raid. That night, at approximately 11 p.m., the police arrived at the Hill household with a warrant for Henry's arrest. They'd been building a drug trafficking case against him for months, using surveillance, wiretaps, and informants. They had him cold, multiple witnesses, recorded conversations, evidence of large-scale drug distribution. Henry Hill was arrested on May 11, 1980, on federal drug trafficking charges. The evidence against him was overwhelming. He was facing serious prison time. 20 years, maybe more, in jail, waiting for his arraignment, waiting to learn what charges he'd face and what evidence the government had against him. Henry had time to think, and what he thought was, I'm going to die. Either he'd be convicted and spend the next 20 or 30 years in federal prison, which at his age might mean dying in prison, or he'd be killed by Jimmy Burke before he ever made it to trial, eliminated like all the other Lufthansa witnesses. Either way, his life as he knew it was over. The dream he'd had since he was 11 years old, the dream of being a gangster, of living the life, of having respect and money and power. That dream was dead. Henry Hill had to make a decision, and it was the most important, most consequential decision of his entire life. At first, Henry Hill refused to cooperate with prosecutors. It went against everything he'd been taught. Never rat on your friends. Always keep your mouth shut. Those were the rules. Those were the commandments that had been drilled into him since he was 12 years old. Henry had grown up in the mob. It was the only life he knew. Paul Vario had been like a father to him, more of a father than his real father had ever been. Jimmy Burke had been his mentor, his friend, his partner in countless crimes. These were his people, his family. The idea of testifying against them, of becoming an informant, of violating omerta, it was unthinkable. It was the worst thing a mobster could do. It was an unforgivable sin. But Henry's situation was different from anything he'd faced before. First, there were the drug charges. Federal prosecutors had him dead to rights. They had surveillance footage, wiretapped conversations, testimony from several of his dealers who'd already been arrested and were cooperating. Henry was looking at a minimum of 20 years in federal prison, possibly more, at 40 years old. 20 years meant he'd be 60 when he got out. An old man, his best years gone, his family destroyed, his life wasted second. And even more terrifying, Henry was increasingly certain that Jimmy Burke wanted him dead. Burke had been reaching out, asking Henry to meet him at isolated locations, asking Henry to help with certain jobs, setting up situations that felt wrong, that felt like traps. Burke's demeanor toward Henry had changed. The warmth was gone. The friendship was gone. There was only calculation now, only assessment of risk and liability. Henry knew what Burke had done to the Lufthansa crew. He'd killed them all. Every single person connected to the heist was either dead or would be dead soon. And Henry knew about Lufthansa. He knew about the planning, about the execution, about the aftermath. He was a witness. He was a liability. If Henry went to prison on the drug charges, he'd be a sitting duck. Burke could easily have him killed in prison. A contract hit carried out by other inmates, or a guard on Burke's payroll, or any of a dozen other methods. In prison, you're vulnerable. You can't protect yourself. You can't run. And if Henry somehow made bail, If he was out on the street before trial, Burke would definitely move against him then. A murder made to look like a drug deal gone wrong, or a random robbery, or just a straightforward execution. Burke would eliminate the threat that Henry represented. There was one meeting in particular that crystallized everything for Henry. Jimmy Burke asked Henry to meet him at a diner. It seemed like a normal request. Two friends getting together for coffee, discussing business. But Henry's instincts screamed at him that something was wrong. Burke wanted Henry to help him kill someone, another loose end, another potential witness to something or other. Burke laid out the plan. They'd lure this person to a specific location. Henry would be there. Together, they'd take care of the problem. But as Burke was explaining this, Henry realized what was really happening. If Henry showed up to help with this hit, Henry would be the one who ended up dead. Burke was setting a trap. The supposed target probably didn't even exist. This was Burke's way of getting Henry alone, isolated, in a position where he could be killed without witnesses. Henry made an excuse. He said he couldn't do it. He had other obligations. He'd help Burke another time. He got out of that diner as quickly as he could, without making Burke suspicious. But he knew that Burke was going to kill him. It was only a matter of time. Karen Hill was terrified. She'd been living with the violence and the danger for years, but this was different. This wasn't theoretical. This wasn't distant. Her husband was going to be killed or sent to prison for decades. Her children were going to lose their father. Everything they'd built, the house, the lifestyle, the money, all of it was about to be destroyed. Karen talked to Henry constantly during this period. She told him what he needed to hear, even though it went against everything they both believed in. You have to save yourself. You have to save our family. You have to do whatever it takes to survive. She was telling him to cooperate, to become an informant, to testify against Paul Vario and Jimmy Burke and everyone else he'd worked with for the past 15 years. It was the ultimate betrayal, but it was also the only way out. Henry Hill made his decision. He would cooperate. He would testify. He would tell the FBI everything he knew about Paul Vario, Jimmy Burke, Tommy DeSimone, and decades of organized crime in New York. He would become a rat. The word rat doesn't quite capture what this meant in the mob world. This wasn't just betrayal. This wasn't just breaking a rule. This was violating the most sacred code, the foundation upon which the entire organization was built. Rats were hunted forever. Their families were hunted. There was no forgiveness, no statute of limitations, no possibility of redemption. Once you became a rat, you were marked for death until the day you died. And not just you, your wife, your children, your parents, your siblings, everyone you loved became a target. But Henry didn't see another option, prison or death. Those were his only choices if he didn't cooperate. At least by cooperating, he had a chance. He and his family would go into witness protection. They'd get new identities, new lives, somewhere far from New York. It wasn't ideal, but it was survival. In late 1980, Henry Hill sat down with FBI agents and federal prosecutors. And he started talking. He told them about the Lufthansa heist. He explained how it was planned, who was involved, how the money was taken, what happened afterward. He told them about the murders, Billy Bats, Spider, all the Lufthansa crew members who'd been systematically eliminated, dozens of other murders going back years. He told them about Paul Vario's operations, the cab stand in Brooklyn, the rackets at JFK Airport, the loan sharking, the gambling, the hijackings, the extortion. He told them about Jimmy Burke's crimes, the heists he'd planned and executed, the murders he'd ordered or committed personally, the bodies buried in the basement of Robert's Lounge. He gave them names, dates, locations, details that only someone on the inside could know. Details that could be verified, that could be used to build prosecutable cases. Henry Hill's testimony would eventually lead to more than 50 convictions. He was one of the most significant cooperating witnesses in the history of organized crime prosecution. He destroyed the Lucchese family's operations in Brooklyn. He sent his former friends and mentors to prison for the rest of their lives. But his testimony came with a price. Henry and his family, Karen and their 2 children, entered the Witness Protection Program. They were given new identities. They were relocated to a different part of the country, far from New York, far from everyone they knew. Henry Hill, the boy who'd always wanted to be a gangster, was now the thing gangsters hated most: an informant, a rat, a witness for the prosecution. His old life was over. His identity was erased. He would spend the rest of his life looking over his shoulder, wondering if someone from his past would find him and execute the sentence that mob justice demanded. But there was one member of the crew who wouldn't live to see Henry's betrayal. One person whose fate had already been sealed, whose murder had been ordered months or even years before Henry decided to cooperate: Tommy DeSimone. The exact date of Tommy DeSimone's murder is uncertain. Different sources give different time frames. Some say late December 1978, just weeks after the Lufthansa heist. Others say early January 1979. A few sources suggest it might have been as late as 1979. The confusion is understandable because Tommy simply vanished, and nobody who knew what happened was willing to talk about it for years. What is certain is that sometime in the winter of 1978-1979, Tommy DeSimone received news that he'd been waiting for his entire adult life. News that should have been the culmination of everything he'd worked for. The achievement that would mark him as a full member of La Cosa Nostra. The moment when he'd finally have the status and protection that came with being made. Tommy was told that he was going to be straightened out. He was going to be inducted as a made man in the Lucchese crime family. For someone like Tommy, who'd grown up in a Mafia family, whose grandfather and uncle had been mob bosses, whose entire life had been oriented toward organized crime, being made was everything. It meant respect. It meant protection. It meant you couldn't be killed without permission from the boss. It meant you'd moved from being a disposable associate to being a valued member of the family. Tommy was excited. This was the validation he'd been seeking. This was proof that all the crimes he'd committed, all the violence he'd inflicted, all the murders, it had all been worth it. He was being recognized. He was being elevated. What Tommy didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that it was a setup. The Billy Batts murder had never been forgotten. The Gambino family, of which Billy had been a made man, had been patient. They'd waited for the right moment. They'd investigated what happened. They'd confirmed that Tommy DeSimone, along with Jimmy Burke and Henry Hill, had killed one of their members without permission. This was a violation that demanded a response. Made men couldn't be killed without authorization. If the Gambino family didn't respond to Billy's murder, it would signal weakness. Other criminals would think they could kill Gambino members without consequence. But there was another murder, too. Another Gambino family member that Tommy had killed. Ronald Foxy Jareth had been a young, up-and-coming criminal in the Gambino family. He was a protege, John Gotti, who would later become the boss of the Gambino family. Gotti had loved Foxy like a son, had been grooming him for bigger things, had seen potential in him, and Tommy DeSimone had killed Foxy. The exact circumstances are unclear. It might have been over a woman, or money, or just Tommy being Tommy, and killing someone for no good reason. But Tommy had murdered Ronald Jareth, and John Gotti had sworn revenge. Gotti was patient. He was smart. He was rising through the Gambino ranks, building his own crew, establishing his reputation. He didn't move rashly. He waited for the right opportunity. And then, in late 1978 or early 1979, that opportunity arrived. The story of how Tommy's murder was arranged involves Paul Vario, which makes the betrayal even more bitter. Vario was Tommy's captain. He was the man Tommy worked for. The man who'd given Tommy opportunities. The man who'd protected Tommy despite his increasingly erratic and violent behavior. But Vario had problems. He needed to maintain good relationships with the other families, particularly the Gambinos, and Tommy had become a liability. His murder of Billy Batts, his murder of Foxy Jareth, his general psychopathy, it was all too much. Tommy was more trouble than he was worth. So when the Gambino family approached Vario and said they wanted Tommy DeSimone dead as payment for the murders of Billy Batts and Foxy Jareth, Vario allegedly gave permission. In the mob hierarchy, this was necessary. If the Lucchese family protected Tommy against legitimate grievances from the Gambino family, it could spark a war between the families. Wars were bad for business. They attracted law enforcement attention. They got people killed. They disrupted profitable operations. Better to sacrifice one soldier, even a valuable one, than risk a family war. So the plan was set. Tommy would be told he was being made. He'd be picked up by trusted members of the Lucchese family, people he'd known for years, people he had no reason to suspect. They'd take him to the location where the ceremony was supposedly going to happen. And there, instead of being inducted into La Cosa Nostra, Tommy DeSimone would be murdered. On the appointed day, again. The exact date is lost to history. Two men came to pick Tommy up, according to most accounts. They were Peter Vario, Paul Vario's son, and Bruno Facciolo, both trusted members of the Lucchese family. They told Tommy to get in the car. They were going to the ceremony location. Tommy would be made today. This was it. The culmination of everything. Tommy got in the car. He was probably dressed well. His best suit, his shoes polished to perfection. He was probably nervous and excited. This was one of the most important days of his life. As they drove, Tommy might have started to notice things that didn't add up. Maybe they were going to the wrong location. Maybe it was the wrong time of day for a ceremony. Maybe the guys in the car were acting strangely. According to Henry Hill, who heard about this later from various sources, Tommy realized something was wrong, either during the drive or when they arrived at the location. Maybe he saw too many cars. Maybe he recognized people who shouldn't have been there. Maybe it was just instinct. That survival instinct that had kept him alive through years of violence. But by the time Tommy understood it was a trap, it was too late. What happened next depends on which account you believe. There are several versions of Tommy DeSimone's death, and the truth is probably unknowable unless someone who was there decides to tell the full story. Version 1, Henry Hill's account. Tommy was taken to a location in Queens or Brooklyn. He was led into a room or a basement, and there, waiting for him, was John Gotti himself. Gotti had asked for the privilege of personally killing the man who murdered his protege Foxy Jareth. Tommy was shot 3 times in the back of the head with a .38 caliber pistol equipped with a silencer. He died instantly. His body was then removed and disposed of. Version 2, Street Rumors. Tommy was tortured before he was killed. He was beaten, mutilated, made to suffer for hours before he was finally executed. Some versions say he was killed by Thomas Agro, a feared Gambino family enforcer known for particularly brutal murders. Some say he was cut in half with a chainsaw, though this detail is probably an exaggeration or myth. Version 3, Alternative Accounts. Tommy was simply shot once in the head and buried immediately. No torture, no elaborate revenge, just a quick execution to settle the debt. What everyone agrees on is that Tommy DeSimone died violently, that he was betrayed by people he trusted, and that his body was never found. The most likely disposal method was burial in the hole, a marshy, undeveloped area near JFK Airport that the mob used as a dumping ground for bodies. The hole was isolated, difficult to search, and had probably absorbed dozens of bodies over the years. If Tommy was buried there, his remains were likely scattered or destroyed by decomposition and water damage long ago. Other theories suggest his body was buried under concrete at a construction site, or dissolved in acid, or crushed in a car compactor like Billy Batts. But without evidence, it's impossible to know for sure. Thomas Anthony DeSimone was officially declared legally dead in 1990, 12 years after his disappearance, but his family held out hope for years that he might somehow still be alive. His mother refused to believe her son was dead. She thought maybe he'd gone into hiding, or been arrested under a false name, or was living somewhere under a new identity. But Tommy was dead. Everyone in the mob knew it. The word spread quickly through the criminal underworld. Tommy DeSimone had been killed for the Billy Batts murder and the Foxy Jarrett murder. Paul Vario had given permission. The Gambinos had executed him. His body was gone forever. Tommy DeSimone was approximately 32 years old when he died, depending on which birth year is accurate. He'd committed probably 20 to 30 murders in his short life. He'd terrorized people throughout New York. He'd lived violently, and he died violently. In the end, Tommy's psychopathy and his inability to control his violent impulses led directly to his death. If he hadn't killed Billy Batts, if he hadn't killed Foxy Jarrett, he might have lived to old age. But Tommy couldn't help himself. Violence was his nature, his default response to everything, and eventually, that violence consumed him. Of the three main figures in the Goodfellas story, Henry Hill, Jimmy Burke, and Tommy DeSimone, Tommy was the first to die. By early 1979, only Henry and Jimmy were left, and those two were heading in very different directions. Jimmy was about to embark on a paranoid murder spree that would claim more than a dozen lives. Henry was about to make the decision that would destroy what was left of the crew and send him into witness protection. But before that final collapse, before Henry became an informant and testified against everyone he'd ever worked with, there were consequences for the surviving members of the crew. There were arrests, trials, and convictions. There was justice of a sort, though it came slowly and imperfectly. Henry Hill's cooperation with the FBI was devastating to the Lucchese crime family and to organized crime in general. His testimony, combined with the evidence the FBI had gathered through years of surveillance and investigation, led to a wave of convictions in the early 1980s that seriously weakened the mob's power in New York. Paul Vario, the man who had given young Henry Hill his start in the mob back in 1955, the man who'd been like a father to him, was one of the first to fall. In 1984, Paul Vario was convicted of fraud. The charge was based on him creating a fake no-show job for Henry Hill. It was a relatively minor charge compared to everything else Vario had done over his long criminal career. The murders, the extortion, the hijackings, the decades of organized crime, but it was enough to send him to federal prison. The way it worked, Vario had arranged for Henry to be on the payroll of a construction company, supposedly as a worker. In reality, Henry never showed up to the job. He collected a paycheck for work he never did. The paychecks were government contracts, which made this federal fraud. And Henry's testimony about this arrangement, combined with payroll records and other documentation, was enough to convict Vario. Vario also faced additional charges for extortion and other crimes, all based on Henry's testimony and the evidence it led investigators to discover. Paul Vario was sentenced to federal prison. He would never be a free man again. On May 3, 1988, Paul Vario died in the Fort Worth Federal Medical Center in Texas. He was 73 years old. The cause of death was respiratory failure, caused by lung cancer. After decades of chain smoking, the cancer had finally caught up with him. Paul Vario died in a prison hospital, hundreds of miles from Brooklyn. Far from the neighborhood where he'd built his empire, he died alone, without his family nearby, without the respect and fear that had defined his life, all the money he'd made. Millions upon millions of dollars accumulated over 5 decades of crime. Didn't matter in the end. He couldn't spend it from prison. His family couldn't access much of it because he'd followed his own rule. Never put your name on anything. The money was hidden, laundered through shell companies and front businesses. Impossible to track or retrieve. Paul Vario's funeral was attended by his immediate family and a few old friends who weren't afraid to be associated with a convicted mobster. There were no parades, no public mourning, no recognition of his status. He was just another dead criminal, buried and forgotten. Jimmy Burke's downfall took longer, but it was just as complete. The FBI could never gather enough evidence to charge Burke with the Lufthansa heist, despite knowing he was the mastermind. Despite interviewing dozens of witnesses, despite years of investigation, they couldn't build a prosecutable case. Too many witnesses were dead. Too much evidence had been destroyed. And Burke had been careful not to leave direct evidence connecting him to the crime. But they got him on other charges. In 1982, Jimmy Burke was convicted in connection with a point-shaving scandal involving the Boston College basketball team. This sounds almost comical. A legendary mob enforcer and heist man brought down by a sports gambling scheme. But that's how federal prosecutors often work. They get you for whatever they can prove, even if it's not the worst thing you've done. The point-shaving scheme worked like this. Burke's crew had bribed players on the Boston College basketball team to deliberately underperform or control the point spread in their games. This allowed Burke and his associates to make guaranteed money betting on the games. Since they knew in advance how the games would be manipulated, Henry Hill had been involved in this scheme and testified about it. The evidence was strong. Burke was convicted and sentenced to 12 years in federal prison. But that wasn't the end. While Burke was serving his sentence for the point-shaving conviction, prosecutors built another case against him. This one was for murder. In 1985, Jimmy Burke was convicted of murdering Richard Eaton, a drug dealer who Burke had killed during a dispute. The evidence came from multiple sources, including Henry Hill's testimony and forensic evidence that connected Burke to the crime. Burke was sentenced to life in prison, life without the possibility of parole, until 2004. He would have been 73 years old in 2004. If he lived that long, Jimmy the Gent Burke, the mastermind of the Lufthansa heist, the man responsible for 60 to 70 murders, the criminal genius who'd terrorized New York for decades, spent the rest of his life in prison. On April 13, 1996, Burke died at Roswell Park Cancer Institute in Buffalo, New York. He was 64 years old. Like Paul Vario, he died of lung cancer. The cigarettes had killed him in the end. Burke died knowing several things. First, that he'd never been convicted of the Lufthansa heist, his greatest achievement. Second, that the $6 million from that heist was never fully recovered. Most of it remains missing to this day. Third, that Henry Hill, the man he'd mentored and worked with for years, had betrayed him and sent him to prison. Burke's funeral was small, attended by his immediate family. His son Frank, who'd been involved in the Lufthansa heist and had avoided prosecution, was there. A few old associates who weren't afraid of being photographed at a mobster's funeral showed up, but there was no grand send-off, no recognition of Burke's status in the criminal world. He was buried in a cemetery in New York, his grave marked with a simple headstone, the greatest heist man of his generation, reduced to a name and 2 dates. Tommy DeSimone was already dead, murdered years earlier. Paul Vario died in prison in 1988. Jimmy Burke died in prison in 1996. The crew that had terrorized New York for decades was gone, destroyed by paranoia, by violence, by their own inability to trust each other, and ultimately by Henry Hill's testimony. But Henry Hill was still alive, and his story was far from over. The Witness Protection Program gave Henry Hill and his family new identities and relocated them far from New York. They were supposed to start over, live quiet, legitimate lives, stay hidden forever. The program was designed to protect witnesses whose testimony was crucial to major prosecutions. Participants were given new names, new social security numbers, new backgrounds. They were moved to different parts of the country, usually places where they had no previous connections. They were given financial assistance to help them establish new lives, help finding jobs, help with housing, help integrating into their new communities. In exchange, participants were expected to follow strict rules. Don't contact anyone from your old life. Don't reveal your true identity. Don't engage in criminal activity. Don't attract attention. Henry Hill lasted about 7 years in witness protection before he broke all of those rules. In 1987, Henry revealed his identity publicly. He started doing interviews, talking about his life in the mob, discussing the crimes he'd committed and the people he'd testified against. This was a massive violation of the Witness Protection Program rules. He was kicked out of the program. He was on his own now, his real name public, his location potentially discoverable, and yet, despite being exposed, despite everyone in the mob knowing who he was and where he was, Henry Hill was never killed. There are several theories about why the mob didn't execute Henry for being a rat. Theory 1. He wasn't worth the trouble. By the late 1980s, the damage was done. Vario was in prison. Burke was in prison. The crew was destroyed. Killing Henry wouldn't change anything, and it would bring enormous law enforcement attention. Theory 2. The Lucchese family was in disarray. Internal conflicts, prosecutions, and power struggles meant there was no unified decision to go after Henry. Different factions had different priorities. Theory 3. Henry had become too high profile. His cooperation with the FBI, his participation in the prosecution of major mob figures, it had made him famous in law enforcement circles. Killing him would be seen as an attack on the federal witness program itself, and the response from law enforcement would be overwhelming. Whatever the reason, Henry lived. But his life after the mob was chaotic and troubled. In 1987, shortly after being kicked out of witness protection, Henry was arrested in Seattle on narcotics charges. He'd gone back to drugs almost immediately. Old habits die hard, especially when you're an addict. He was convicted and served a short sentence. When he got out, he drifted for a while, trying different things, never really settling. Henry worked various jobs over the years. He was a chef at an Italian restaurant in Nebraska for a while. He actually was a good cook. That detail from Goodfellas was accurate. He enjoyed cooking, found it calming, took pride in making good food. In 2007, Henry opened a restaurant called Wise Guys in Connecticut. It was Italian food, mob-themed decor. Trading on his notoriety. For a while, it did decent business. People came to see the real Henry Hill, to eat food made by a former mobster, to hear his stories. But the restaurant closed after a suspicious fire, whether it was insurance fraud, an electrical problem, or something else. The restaurant was gone, and Henry was back to figuring out what came next. But Henry's real career in his later years was as a professional former mobster. He'd figured out that people were fascinated by his story, and he was willing to tell it over and over for money. He wrote books, starting with Wise Guy in 1986, written with journalist Nicholas Pileggi. This was the book that Martin Scorsese would adapt into Goodfellas. The book was detailed, honest about the violence and the criminal lifestyle. and it became a bestseller. Henry followed up with more books. The Wise Guy Cookbook in 2002, featuring recipes including his famous tomato sauce. Gangsters and Goodfellas in 2004, more stories and reflections on his life. The Lufthansa Heist in 2015, published posthumously. Co-written with Daniel Simone, focusing specifically on the heist that had changed everything. Henry appeared on countless documentaries and TV shows. He was interviewed constantly, local news, national news, crime shows, podcasts, radio programs. He told his stories again and again, each time with slightly different details. Each time for payment, he did speaking engagements. He attended mob memorabilia conventions, signing autographs alongside former FBI agents and other ex-mobsters who turned their criminal pasts into second careers. He did a photo shoot for Entertainment Weekly with Ray Liotta, the actor who'd played him in Goodfellas. The two men stood side by side, the real Henry and the fictional Henry, both profiting from the story of Henry's life. Henry marketed his own brand of pasta sauce called Sunday Gravy. Trading on his cooking skills and his notoriety, the sauce was reportedly pretty good. Henry actually knew how to cook. In all of this, Henry was charming. Self-deprecating, funny in interviews, he'd tell stories about the violence and the crimes with a kind of dark humor. He'd acknowledge his mistakes. He'd express some regret, though it often felt performative, like he was saying what people expected to hear rather than what he really felt. The truth is that Henry never seemed to fully regret his time in the mob. He regretted getting caught. He regretted having to become an informant. He regretted losing his old life. But the actual crimes, the actual violence, those seemed to hold no real weight for him. Henry's marriage to Corinne eventually fell apart. The stress of witness protection, of Henry's continued drug use, of the lies and the violence and the betrayals, it was too much. They divorced, and Henry moved on to other relationships. In his final years, Henry lived with his girlfriend, Lisa Caserta, in Los Angeles. He had health problems, decades of drug use, alcohol abuse, cigarette smoking, and stress had taken their toll. His heart was failing. His liver was damaged. His body was breaking down. On June 12, 2012, one day after his 69th birthday, Henry Hill died from complications related to heart disease. He died in a hospital in Los Angeles. With Lisa Caserta by his side, he died peacefully, which is more than can be said for most of the people in his story. He went out pretty peacefully, for a good fella, one friend said at the time. Henry Hill's obituary ran in the New York Times, the Washington Post, major newspapers across the country. His death was covered on television news. The man who'd been a criminal, an informant, a celebrity, and a cautionary tale was gone. Of the three main figures from the Goodfellas story, Henry Hill, Jimmy Burke, and Tommy DeSimone, Henry was the only one who died free, the only one who got to live to old age, the only one who escaped the violent death that claimed so many of his former associates. But he paid a price for that survival. He lived in fear for years after leaving witness protection, always wondering if someone would finally come for him. He destroyed his marriage and his relationship with his children, who struggled with having a father who was both famous and infamous. He never had another chance at the life he'd once had, the life where he was somebody in a neighborhood full of nobodies. Henry spent the last decades of his life telling his story over and over, reliving the worst moments of his existence for entertainment and profit. He became a kind of museum exhibit of himself, a living reminder of what the mob life really was. In the end, Henry Hill became exactly what he'd always feared, a schnook, an average person, someone outside the life. He'd said it himself in the famous last lines of Goodfellas. "I'm an average nobody. I get to live the rest of my life like a schnook." That was his punishment. Not death, Not prison, but ordinariness. The loss of everything that had made him feel special, important, powerful. Henry Hill had wanted to be a gangster more than anything else in the world. And for about 30 years, he was. He had the respect, the money, the lifestyle, the power, but in exchange, he lost his identity, his family, his friends, and his dignity. He became a rat, forever marked by his betrayal, forever separated from the world he'd loved. Maybe being president would have been better after all. In 1985, journalist Nicholas Pileggi was researching a book about organized crime in New York. He'd covered the mob for years as a reporter, had sources throughout law enforcement and the criminal world, and was looking for a story that would capture the reality of mob life. Not the romanticized version from movies, but the actual brutal, chaotic truth. Pileggi heard about Henry Hill, this former mobster who'd entered witness protection after testifying against his crew. Hill had stories, decades of stories about life in the Lucchese family, about major crimes, about murders and heists, and the day-to-day operations of organized crime. Pileggi approached Hill and proposed a collaboration. Hill would tell his stories, and Pileggi would write them in a book that would be as accurate and detailed as possible. Hill agreed. He needed money. Witness protection didn't pay that well, and he was willing to tell his story. For months, Pileggi interviewed Hill. He verified facts through court records, FBI files, interviews with law enforcement, and conversations with other criminals and witnesses. He was meticulous about accuracy, about getting the details right. The result was Wise Guy, published in 1986. The book was detailed, violent, and honest. It didn't romanticize the mob. It showed the brutal reality, the casual violence, the paranoia, the betrayals, the grinding criminality of it all. Martin Scorsese read the book while it was still in galley form, uncorrected proofs before official publication. He read it in one sitting and immediately knew it had to be a film. Scorsese had grown up in New York, in neighborhoods where the mob was a presence. He understood the culture, the language, the rhythms of that world. He knew that Pileggi's book captured something authentic, something that hadn't been shown in movies before. Scorsese called Pileggi and said, "I've been waiting for this book my entire life." They decided to collaborate on the screenplay. Scorsese would direct, Pileggi would write the script based on his book, and together they'd create the most realistic mob movie ever made. The film was originally titled Wise Guy, matching the book, but there was another film with a similar title in production, so they changed it to Goodfellas for legal reasons. They changed some names. Tommy DeSimone became Tommy DeVito. Paul Vario became Paulie Cicero. Jimmy Burke became Jimmy Conway. The story about Burke's name is particularly telling. Scorsese approached Burke's daughter and asked permission to use his real name in the film. She demanded $100,000. Scorsese declined and just changed the name to Conway. The casting was crucial. Scorsese needed actors who could capture the authenticity of the characters, who could make this world feel real. Ray Liotta was cast as Henry Hill. Liotta brought a nervous energy to the role, a sense of someone who's in over his head but can't admit it. He captured Henry's love for the life, combined with his eventual terror when it all falls apart. Robert De Niro played Jimmy Conway Burke. De Niro had worked with Scorsese before on several films. He brought gravitas and menace to Jimmy, making him seem both charming and terrifying. You could see why people would want to work with Jimmy and why they'd be afraid of him. Joe Pesci was cast as Tommy DeVito, DeSimone. This was inspired casting. Pesci is short, about 5'7", which is the opposite of the real Tommy, who was over 6 feet tall. But Pesci captured something essential about Tommy, the violent unpredictability, the rage that could erupt at any second, the famous funny how. Scene where Tommy intimidates Henry at a dinner by pretending to be offended when Henry calls him funny, was based on a real incident from Joe Pesci's life. Before becoming an actor, Pesci had worked as a waiter. One night, he told a mobster that he was funny. The mobster's mood immediately changed, became dark and threatening. Funny how? Like a clown? Am I here to amuse you? Pesci shared this story during rehearsals for Goodfellas. Scorsese loved it and had the actors improvise a scene based on it. The result is one of the most memorable and tense scenes in the film, capturing perfectly how mob interactions could turn dangerous in an instant. Pesci won the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor for his performance as Tommy. In his acceptance speech, he gave one of the shortest Oscar speeches ever. "It's my privilege. Thank you. Very much in character." What did the movie change for reality? First, the film portrays Paulie Cicero, Paul Vario, as relatively calm and restrained. Almost grandfatherly, the real Paul Vario was violent and explosive, beating people with baseball bats over minor insults. The film softened him considerably. Second, the movie omits some of the darker details to keep the focus on the main narrative. Paul Vario allegedly had an affair with Karen Hill, Henry's wife. Tommy DeSimone attempted to rape Karen at one point. These incidents were left out of the film, probably because they would make the characters even more repellent and would complicate the story. Third, the film simplifies the violence. In reality, these men committed far more murders than the movie depicts. The body count was higher. The brutality was worse. The casual nature of the killing was even more pronounced. Fourth, the movie compresses time and combines characters for narrative efficiency. Some events are moved around chronologically. Some characters are composites of multiple real people. But what did the movie get right? It captured the casual nature of the violence. In Goodfellas, people are killed suddenly, without dramatic music or elaborate setups. Someone's telling a joke, and then they're dead. That's how it really was. It captured the paranoia. The film shows how everyone in the mob is constantly watching everyone else, constantly worried about betrayal, constantly assessing loyalty and risk. It captured the seductive appeal of the lifestyle, followed by the ugly reality. The film makes you understand why Henry wanted this life. The money, the respect, the sense of belonging. And then it shows you the horror of what that life actually entails. It captured the language and the culture. Scorsese and Pileggi got the slang right. The rhythms of speech, the way mobsters interact with each other. The film feels authentic in a way that most mob movies don't. It captured the trajectory, rise and fall. The film shows how Henry goes from an 11-year-old kid full of dreams to a middle-aged man in witness protection, having lost everything. Martin Scorsese himself called Goodfellas a mob home movie. It's not a romanticized epic like The Godfather. It's not a stylized thriller. It's just a realistic depiction of what mob life actually was. Brutal, chaotic, ultimately self-destructive. Goodfellas was released in 1990 to critical acclaim. It was nominated for 6 Academy Awards, including Best Picture and Best Director. It won 1, Joe Pesci for Best Supporting Actor. The film became hugely influential. Its style, the use of voiceover narration, the popular music soundtrack, the long tracking shots, the freeze frames, has been copied countless times. 27 actors from Goodfellas went on to appear in The Sopranos, creating a kind of mob acting repertory company. In 2000, Goodfellas was selected for preservation in the National Film Registry by the Library of Congress for being culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant. The film's influence on popular culture is immeasurable. Lines from the movie, "Funny how," "As far back as I can remember," "Now go home and get your shine box," became part of the cultural vocabulary. But more than its artistic influence, Goodfellas did something unprecedented. It made the real Henry Hill more famous than he'd ever been as a criminal. The film turned Henry into a celebrity. It gave him a second life as a professional storyteller. It ensured that his story would be remembered and studied decades after the actual events. And it preserved the story of three men from Brooklyn, Henry Hill, Jimmy Burke, and Tommy DeSimone, who wanted power, wealth, and respect, and who ultimately got death, prison, and betrayal instead. The movie ends with Henry in witness protection, living as a schnook, mourning the loss of his old life. The real Henry lived that way for another 22 years after the film came out, constantly reliving his past, constantly selling his story, constantly reminded of what he'd lost. Goodfellas is many things. A masterpiece of American cinema, a brutal crime film, a cautionary tale about the mob. But it's also a document of real events, real people, real crimes, and that reality is darker, more complex, and more tragic than any fiction could be. The real story behind Goodfellas is darker than the movie. Bloodier, more complex, more tragic, but it's also achingly human. These weren't monsters from another world. They were men who made choices, who wanted things, who built something and then watched it destroy them. And that's the true story, the story of Henry Hill, Jimmy Burke, Tommy DeSimone, and Paul Vario, real mobsters, real crimes, real consequences. In the mob, there are no happy endings. There are only survivors and casualties. And sometimes, like Henry Hill, you're both at the same time. If you made it this far, thank you for spending these hours with me in the shadows of New York's underworld. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the real Goodfellas, make sure you're subscribed to this channel. We've got more true crime stories, more Mafia history, more tailies from America's dark corners coming your way. Hit that like button if you want to see more stories like this. Share this with anyone who loves Goodfellas, true crime, or just a compelling story about real people and real events. Until next time, sleep well, and remember, in the mob, there are no happy endings. There's only survival. And there's a price for that too. This has been the true story behind Goodfellas, the real mobsters, the real crimes, the real consequences. Thank you for listening.